All right, welcome everybody. I made a last second change to the topic today. I was going to be talking about something that I wrote a while ago, but I opted to talk about something that's more recent and topical. So I guess the first thing is let's just make sure everything is working and that we're good to go. Uh, okay, so I do have someone saying that they got first on the comments. So I don't get a ton of people in my stream, so that's probably not super challenging. All right, and then we have Jonathan Becker saying, "Ooh, new topic. Wonder what brought this on." So there's also a wink there. So this was brought on by an exchange. I'll give you a bit of the history. This is stuff that's all happened in the past week. So I posted something a while ago, and I did have someone complain. Rightly so. I say complain. Someone said, "Hey, you kept talking about this, and then you didn't actually read it or say what it was." So I posted something on Facebook. Now I'm still on Facebook. I still post stuff there. More of my stuff is posted here, like in the community section, but I still post stuff on there. So here's the timeline. I posted something talking about how I was frustrated with a lot of the sort of current state of analytic philosophy. Nathan from Digital Gnosis made a similar remark on Twitter or X or whatever it's supposed to be called now. And then also screenshotted that Facebook post and was like, I concur. Now, that particular post, so my post got some reactions, like, I don't know, 10 or 20. I don't know. I'm going to go to the post because I'm going to actually read it this time. Anyway, so I got some reaction, but Nathan's post on whatever it's called, the former Twitter site, I guess. I'm going to pull it up. But it had, I think the last time I looked, it looked like it had 110,000 views. Maybe I'm bad at reading the amount of views things have because it seems like way too many. But give me a second. And so what the plan for today is to go over that and talk a little bit about that discussion that we had, and then get everybody caught up to speed on some other developments. One of them is, I think it was just this morning, Majesty of Reason, Joe Schmidt over at Majesty of Reason, posted a video asking, is philosophy useless? And with big, no. So I also am planning a little bit after getting you the world, at least my little bubble of the philosophy world that's been going on, my very tiny, tiny bubble. I'll go over some news, some stuff, some experiences and discussions and that sort of thing, and give a little background on the discussion with Digital Gnosis. And then we'll talk about, and then I plan to review. I haven't done this on a Saturday stream. I did do one in the middle of the week where I reviewed the Trent Horn and Destiny debate. If you haven't seen that, that has my most views of any video. So I thought it went really well. That was a Danny from Phil Talk, where we reviewed the meta-ethical portions of the Trent Horn and Destiny discussion, where I think they were talking about like applied ethics type stuff, but there was some meta ethics came up in there. And so I did some commentary in that. I want to do something similar to that today. Danny isn't here though. Danny makes everything easier. So maybe Danny can join us later. I already invited him. So I'll be showing the Majesty of Reason video and then reacting to that because, and I already watched the video, so it's not going to be a candid reaction. And I think I mostly agree with it, but I will give a critical, or I guess you could say sort of, because, the question is philosophy useless? No, like, yeah, I agree. It's not useless, but I do think that there are concerns that could be masked by a sort of categorical yes, no answer. Anyway, so let me pull up this background of what has been going on. It's going back a few days now. Let's see. I'm still looking for it. Oh, wow. Does that art go all the way back to the 8th? That goes back to before my last stream. So maybe I talked about it the last stream and totally forgot about it or something. I don't know. Okay, so let's see. I'm pulling up the tweet now, and then I have my own comment. Yeah, it says 116,000 views. So I guess not too many people are viewing it since it must have been really popular about a week ago, and then it sort of bottoms out. Okay, so here is, let me see if I could share my screen. I don't want to share that though. Give me 1 second. It might be easier to do that. It's not worth figuring out now. I'll figure it out once I go over to the show video, because I'm in 2 different browsers right now. All right, so here is the remark that I had initially made. I am so fed up with contemporary philosophy, I think I need an extended break. Its problems are too obvious, too severe, too ubiquitous, and too tedious to point out, for doing so to be the solution. It seems more like a religion composed of convoluted dogmas than a serious academic discipline. After having someone tell me that I simply must, and in fact do believe precisely the nonsense I've endeavored to diagnose and critique for over a decade, I've simply had enough for now. If philosophy instills in its adherents the profound arrogance to believe that they can determine how other people in fact think from the armchair, I want no part of it. Questions about what people think are questions for psychology. Philosophers constantly gripe about science encroaching on its territory, but philosophers consistently have qualms about making sweeping claims about how people speak, think, and act, and what the world must be like, all by using inscrutable methods that don't require them to so much as walk outside or talk to someone who doesn't have the same education and training that they do. I really botched this one. I'm just tired of it. I need to break a damn long one. So where I'm coming from with this is, in ongoing discussions, and this is not like a recent thing. This is something that I experienced and encountered as an undergraduate in philosophy, as a graduate student in philosophy. Then I shifted over to psychology and was still engaging with philosophy. And then after finishing, there is this longstanding tendency within academic philosophy, analytic philosophy, and the sort of the degree to which it sort of trickles into the extra academic atmosphere, where philosophers have this tendency to think that people's judgments, beliefs, thoughts, the way that they speak, a lot of it is driven by an implicit sort of inchoate, like principled philosophical considerations. The terms that they use, the words that they use, have these deployment conditions that are driven by these, like they don't have to explicitly know the philosophical principles driving their judgments, but they're under the hood. So one example of this would be a lot of the moral psychological research. Take the dual process model of moral cognition. There's this presumption that you have these two. I shouldn't say it's a presumption. There is a theory that has been put forward to account for normative moral judgment, which proposes that we have a deontological and a consequentialist disposition given the activation of 2 distinct psychological systems. And these systems tend to deliver outputs that roughly accord with the deontological philosophical approach and a consequentialist or utilitarian approach. Now, the presumption there is that, like, the way that people with these two normative theories that have dominated the analytic philosophical tradition, and that it's real, like the way that human moral judgment occurs, we have these systems in it. This is not something that we pick up from culture. It's not something that we learn about in school. This system is structured in a way that roughly accords. And I say roughly accords. I see these systems just described as though you have the deontology system and the consequentialist system, as though the philosophical theories that philosophers have devised are built into the structure of our minds. That strikes me as profoundly implausible. Now, it could turn out that these systems tend to deliver outputs for reason, like it could be that the reason philosophers developed a deontological approach and a consequentialist approach is precisely because they were sort of mapping out in a principled way the underlying psychological system that was already there. And so the causality is actually reversed. It's not so much that philosophers invented deontology and consequentialism from like pure reasoning, and then we found out that we have these 2 systems that happen to comport with them. Rather, it's that we have the 2 systems, and that has caused us to develop the 2 philosophical accounts. And part of the reason why disputes remain so intractable between these 2 accounts is because they're both the deliverances of distinct psychological systems. If you put it that way, it's a lot less implausible. But my concern is that it's not so obvious that we should expect the 2 distinct systems to function in a way that actually comports with these philosophical accounts. It's the way that the theory was devised is it wasn't devised necessarily in a way where someone was drawing on those systems and then developing the theory. The causality here of how the philosophical account was actually structured is not so clear. And it's not at all clear. I mean, it's possible that consequentialist theories, deontological theories, these sorts of things are much more driven by path-dependent features of the way that philosophy has in fact progressed, and that there isn't so strong an underlying degree to which we have distinct psychological mechanisms that actually comport with those theories. And what we're really seeing is a kind of projection, or a sort of, what's the phrase, trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, where, okay, fine, maybe we have these two systems and we're going to try to map these on to our theories. In other words, the point is here that it could be that our underlying psychology really does comport with these philosophical theories, and it does so because the philosophical theories are actually a product in part of the underlying psychological mechanisms. But there's also a tendency to, I think, flip this around. And for philosophers, and it's not just philosophers, even scientists will do this, is to have certain sorts of theories, accounts, views, ways of seeing the world, and then to presuppose that they are or must be a part of human psychology, and then to devise methods and measures and psychological research in a way where you are convinced that that is what you're going to find. And you sort of force fit, however awkwardly it actually turns out to be, the way that human psychology is structured to comport with your theories. And I suspect that, in fact, is what's going on. And I think this is one of the reasons why a lot of these theories when you start to zoom in, they start to have problems. I mean, among other concerns that I have with consequentialism and deontology being features of the way that we're characterizing the outputs of these systems is that deontology and consequentialism don't necessarily entail any particular response to a philosophical issue without very well stipulated characteristics of it. So for instance, if you're a utilitarian and someone says, imagine a scenario where there's two options, one option maximizes utility. Well, of course, utilitarianism is going to say that you choose that option, because utilitarianism just is the view that what you should do is to maximize utility. But take something like the trolley problem. Is it just a feature of deontology that you shouldn't push a person in the footbridge dilemma? No, it's not. It is not a feature built into deontology. So deontology is a normative philosophical approach, which holds that the sort of locus of judgment for whether an action is right or wrong, like what it is that makes an action right or wrong, is whether it comports with certain sets of duties, rules, obligations, that sort of thing. It's a rule-based system that doesn't necessarily say do whatever yields the best consequences. It's here's basically a list of things, a list of principles and rules. You should follow the list of principles and rules. Now, those rules could include things like maximize utility or minimize unnecessary suffering or something like that. And so in practice, a deontological approach could furnish us with something that looks very, very similar to the kinds of conclusions that a philosopher reaches. And so what actually distinguishes consequentialism and deontology is not the outputs. It's not the which action they judge between two actions is right or wrong, unless, again, it's specified. Basically, unless you're baking deontology or consequentialism into the description of the output. So unless you say this outcome, you give them B maximizes utility. Well, of course, then the utilitarian or the consequentialist is going to favor that outcome. And if you say this one breaks a rule or violates a principle, then insofar as a deontological system endorses adhering to the rule or not violating the principle, then of course it's going to go with whichever one doesn't violate the relevant principle or break the relevant rule. But if you just give a scenario like abortion or euthanasia or the trolley problem or the footbridge dilemma, where you're not specifying something like the consequences or what rules might be violated, you're just giving the scenario and asking someone, which do you think you should do? You can give a consequentialist rationale both for pushing and not pushing in the footbridge dilemma. And you can give a deontological rationale both for pushing and not pushing in the footbridge dilemma. The bottom line is that what distinguishes the two normative theories is why it's morally permissible or impermissible or right or wrong or obligatory or whatever to do something. It's why, not what you should do, but why you should do it. And it isn't a feature of the outputs themselves that determines why you would make those decisions. And so it could be that on reflection, given a certain set of considerations, we judge that pushing someone in the footbridge dilemma would maximize outcomes. And that seems fairly plausible. But it's not so clear that a deontologist would be necessarily committed to not pushing in the footbridge dilemma, because they could endorse certain sorts of deontological principles You could be a threshold deontologist, or you could just be a deontologist that says, look, you shouldn't act so as to bring about a person's death, unless doing so would prevent deaths to a greater number of people. So you can have all these caveats and qualifiers that are completely consistent with deontology. And so do I think that the dual process model can't survive this? No, because all those systems have to do is give outputs that happen to comport with the outputs of deontology and consequentialism. It doesn't have to be that it's part of the structure of the way that the brain processes the information, that it processes that in like where it actually employs consequentialist or deontological rationales and then delivers the output. As long as it delivers an output that comports with what on reflection we would say about these theories, okay, so then it's roughly approximating what we think a certain type of deontological account, maybe some Kantian account, and a certain kind of consequentialist or utilitarian account would deliver to us. But I think there are a lot of really critical questions to ask here. I mean, among other things, it's not so clear that all societies everywhere have a distinct conception of morality as a particular normative category, as a particular distinct normative domain. I spoke with Sacris maybe a month or two ago, talking about moral judgments. I don't even think moral judgments are a natural kind. I don't think there's a type of judgment that is distinctively a moral judgment. And so the very idea of distinct systems for making moral judgments in particular, I don't think that's been well established as a genuine thing. It's not at all clear that all societies have clear cognate terms for moral terminology in the way that it's typically used in English or in other in Western European languages. And so you're going to get linguistic, cultural, and psychological variation around the world. That isn't to say, because some people misunderstand that to be indicating, oh, so you're saying that outside of weird populations, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic populations, that outside those populations, people have no rules. That is absolutely 100% not what is being claimed. Rather, it's that the very notion that there are moral norms and non-moral norms. If you ask someone in the United States which sorts of things are moral and which ones aren't, first of all, the research on that already shows that people within the United States don't agree with each other. They're going to give very different answers than one another. But it's very difficult to give some sort of clear and obvious principled conditions for what does or does not count as a moral issue. And research on, you have for instance, moral foundations theory, has shown that certain sorts of populations will tend to moralize some issues to a greater degree than other populations. And so at the very least, it's a matter of comparative, the degree to which people emphasize certain sorts of considerations and tend to moralize those. But one of the things that's interesting about moral foundations theory is moral foundations theory purports to show that there are 5, 6, maybe more moral foundations. That doesn't mean that the people that are employing these sorts of normative foundations themselves regard them all as moral foundations. So there is this sense, and I think it's a culturally and linguistically acquired sense, that there's a sort of broad category that certain sorts of norms fall into that we tend to call moral norms. But that does not mean every society everywhere carves out or distinguishes a special category of norm that comports with the way that we think about those norms. Now, what that doesn't mean is that if you don't think the way that weird populations do about normativity, then you don't have normativity. That is a frustratingly absurd conclusion that someone might reach. Rather, it's that different societies, if you want to say, look, if you have a normative system that regulates cooperation, interpersonal interactions, and I'm going to call all of those systems moral systems. Like if you operationalize it that broadly, sure, okay, then every society is going to have moral norms. But when you start trying to get specific about what it is that makes a moral norm, for instance, you could say moral norms are about minimizing harm or promoting equality or this or that thing. You could encounter a society that says, look, first of all, they might not speak English, and so they're not going to be using the word moral. They might have their own normative terminology. And that normative terminology, if you ask them, well, what sorts of things count as this type of norm, they may mention harm and fairness, but they might emphasize other sorts of things. They might emphasize hierarchy or loyalty or respect or certain sorts of religious considerations that would not be central or paradigmatic from a weird population perspective. And they might say, no, these are central to the normative system that they endorse in a way that doesn't comport with weird conceptions of morality. So you already are going to have there's this massive cultural overlay. And so we're talking about a dual process model of moral cognition. Why would we even presume that everybody everywhere has distinctive capacities for moral cognition in the first place? What exactly does that mean? Do we have good evidence that everyone everywhere has an evolved predisposition to think in distinctively moral terms? I don't think that we do. I haven't mentioned it much on the channel, at least not lately. There's this great chapter that was really influential for me by Edward Mashery and Ron Mallon called Evolution of Morality. And what they do in that article is they disambiguate this claim that morality evolved into at least 3 distinct claims. One of the claims is that some of the psychological mechanisms involved in moral judgment were the product of natural selection. So, for instance, emotions, a concern with fairness, like a sense of like judging the distribution of resources, certain sorts of concerns about harm, other sorts of concerns, social hierarchical relations, deference to authority, those sorts of things. The various sorts of psychological mechanisms that play a role in facilitating those types of judgments and the behaviors and psychological states associated with them. Could some of those have been a product of natural selection? Well, of course. In other words, when people engage in moral judgment, are some of the psychological mechanisms involved in those judgments, were they themselves subject to natural selection? That seems really plausible. Like emotions aren't a product of natural selection. That'd be strange. And of course, emotions play a role in moral judgment, but of course, emotions also play a role outside moral judgment. So it's not as if, our basic set of emotions evolved for specifically the purposes of engaging in moral judgment. So could some of the psychological mechanisms that are involved in moral judgment themselves have evolved? Sure. It might be difficult in any particular circumstance to figure out exactly which ones are which and how they evolved and what the selective pressures were that gave rise to that particular trait. But what that doesn't show is that a distinctive capacity for moral cognition was itself selected for via natural selection. So set that aside. It might be true, but it's not true. It would only show, some of the stuff we used for morality itself evolved. For comparison, are some of the psychological mechanisms involved in playing chess a product of natural selection? Sure. Like at the very basic level, people, move pieces. So like motor coordination and vision, certain types of thinking in abstract terms of categories and moving things across a board. Because of course you could play mental chess if you want. The various mechanisms involved in our ability to play chess, those are a product of natural selection, but they didn't evolve for playing chess. And by analogy, it could be that many of the mechanisms involved in moral judgment evolved, but they didn't evolve for moral judgment. So that should illustrate, what the concern here is. Sure, some of the mechanisms might have evolved. It doesn't mean that morality evolved. So you see people saying morality evolved all the time, and it's just super underdeveloped and unspecified what the heck they're talking about or what that means. The second claim that they consider is that normative cognition evolved. So normativity just being should, shouldn't, good, bad. This includes evaluative consideration, so good, bad, but it also includes sort of deontic terminology like should, shouldn't, must not. So any of that sort of terminology that you would associate with prescriptivity, like telling people what's good or bad or right or wrong or should or shouldn't, all that sort of stuff, permissible, impermissible, could a capacity for thinking in those terms and developing norms within a society be a product of natural selection? They argue that seems pretty plausible. It seems plausible that people would devise normative systems. But then finally, they consider this claim that a capacity for distinctively moral cognition evolved. And in that case, the evidence is not so good. And they discuss that in paper. I'm not going to get into that here because this is already a massive digression. But if morality as a distinctive type of cognition didn't evolve, it's pretty strange to have a dual process model of moral cognition. And one thing to know about how that dual process model was developed is that it relies almost entirely on presenting people with sacrificial dilemmas. By this, I mean, would it be permissible or obligatory or whatever to, cause X amount of harm in order to that a larger amount of harm takes place? So in the switch case, I'm sure you're all familiar with the trolley and footbridge dilemma. Train headed down the tracks, it's going to hit 5 people. Unless you do something, you could pull a switch. If you do, it'll divert it onto a sidetrack and it'll hit one person instead. So it's a sacrificial dilemma in the sense that you're sacrificing one life to save 5 lives. Footbridge dilemma is very similar, except in that case, instead of pulling a switch, you have to push a person off a bridge and they fall to their death and their body stops the train from hitting 5 people. Again, you're sacrificing one person to save 5. Now, what's really strange about this account of moral cognition is that it relies almost entirely. Now, there are variations. It's not only footbridge and switch cases. There are other types of sacrificial dilemmas. Some of them are more plausible than that. Like, it's not a very realistic scenario, but they're just sacrificial dilemmas. As if all normative cognition has to do with killing and saving, or preventing harm by causing some degree of harm. First of all, that is even an appropriate characterization of any form of consequentialism I'm familiar with, including utilitarianism. There's been some research by Kahan and collaborators that have, this research has pointed out that, utilitarianism is about the impartial maximization of welfare. So you're supposed to minimize as much suffering as possible in an impartial way and maximize as much well-being in an impartial way. And so if you wanted to show that a certain system delivered outputs consistent with utilitarianism, and of course, consequentialism is just the broader category that says, hey, what makes an action right or wrong are its consequences. Utilitarianism is a type of consequentialism that says, yeah, it's about consequences only, and specifically about increasing happiness, decreasing suffering. And so it has these conditions, maximizing. It's not like if, you just choose if one action is good enough in causing happiness rather than suffering, then compared to some other action, then you choose that. It's about specifically choosing out of a range of options. Consider whatever your option set is, whether it's A and B, A, B, C, A, B, C, D. You have to figure out to the best of your ability which one would maximize utility, the one that has the highest amount of well-being and the least amount of suffering. Now, how you weigh those against each other is more complicated. But assuming you could somehow turn this all into commensurable units, you have to maximize, and it's wrong not to maximize. It's not worse. It's you ought always maximize. So it has this maximization component. Now, that's not necessarily true of all consequentialist systems. Then it has this impartial one. You can't favor some people over other people or some outcomes over other outcomes. Now, again, there's qualifiers. So some utilitarian systems might say certain types of well-being are better than other sorts of well-being, or they might allow for some caveat or some personal prerogative, which says, hey, you can deviate a little bit from the overall system, or they might, place what sorts of things you ought to impartially maximize, and they might consider some other sort of thing, like you have to impartially maximize preferences, or they might weight happiness and suffering differently and say you need to emphasize suffering to a greater degree than happiness. There's all sorts of different systems, and of course, that itself is another issue. Which one of these systems is this feature of human moral cognition supposed to comport with? Who knows? So, that's already, it's like very vague what it's supposed to be dealing with. But anyway, so utilitarianism, impartially maximizing utility. Now, if you wanted to figure out whether a system delivered that kind of output, you would need to show that it reliably delivered outputs where when a person was given a range of options, when they're utilizing that system, they always favor or at least, I guess, tend to favor maximizing, that they tend to do so impartially, and that their specific concern is, or at least it happens to be a feature of the output that they choose, whichever outcome would yield the most happiness and the least suffering. That is not illustrated in sacrificial dilemmas. It's not. So it doesn't show that people always maximize. It doesn't show that people are impartially concerned with welfare. It doesn't, it's not even showing necessarily impartiality, because a lot of these scenarios are so decontextualized. It's a bunch of strangers. What if it's a person's friends or family? Are they going to still deliver the same output? Probably not. I think there's probably research on that too. And so it's not the case that this type of system is giving a clear utilitarian indication. So maybe it's just consequentialist. I think it's a lot harder to which consequences, what other characteristics are supposed to be associated with the outputs of the system. Anyway, I've said a whole lot about this. My point here is just that, philosophers seem to presuppose that the philosophical theories that they have are these neatly packaged sort of refinements of some unconscious human psychology that's shared between people. And I don't think that that's very plausible. So I said a lot there. Let me have a look at the comments. So Dominic says, I knew this was coming. Oh, you're right. So talking today about the problems with philosophy. And I know I digressed and I read my comment and I didn't get to Nathan's yet, but I will get to it. Okay, so I remember you told me what SANKASR Can you let me know? I'm sorry, it's been so long that I forgot. So anyway, they said, hey, Lance, it's been ages, been super busy. How have you been? I've been super busy too. I did take a few weeks off. I started up again a week or two ago, and I'm back. And I'm already doing an epic, like 25-minute digression, but I'll get back into the topic. Magnum Opus says, why does this stuff make philosophy a waste of time? I just joined. Oh, so why does that stuff make philosophy a waste of time? Well, for me, because I have a background in philosophy and psychology, and I do interdisciplinary research that draws on both, one of my concerns is that a lot of what philosophers will do is they will make claims about which philosophical view is more commonsensical or which one comports with ordinary people or non-philosophers' intuitions. And I take those to be empirical claims. And I, in my own work, defend, with respect to metaethics. Let me pause. So Cass says, great to have, so that's Sankasr. Great to have you back. And Cass is normally the way to shorten it. Thank you. Okay, so sorry, I forgot. It's so long. I do my best. Okay, so regarding Magnum Opus's question, why does this stuff make philosophy a waste of time? That is a very long question, and it would be such a digression that I don't want to get too far into it. But one of my concerns, and this is something that I personally emphasize a great deal, is that philosophers often make presumptions about how non-philosophers think. I take them to be pretty straightforwardly empirical claims, and philosophers frequently don't bother to gather data, and they seem resistant to considering data that would challenge their presumptions about which sorts of views are shared by ordinary people or that sort of thing. A big thing that I've been pushing is when philosophers say, such and such is intuitive or counterintuitive, or something seems to be the case or doesn't seem to be the case. Usually that's stated in a way where it's unqualified and underspecified. It seems that way to who? It's intuitive to who? To the philosopher telling you this? To what is it what they think a rational person would conclude under particular sorts of conditions? It's totally unclear what it is that what sort of claim they're actually making. And when they use that language, you might say, okay, well, just take it to be it's implicitly indexed to themselves. So when someone says, yeah, realism is intuitive, they mean realism is intuitive to me. But I'm not so sure that that's actually true. I think in a lot of these cases, there is a presumption that it's intuitive to me, but it's also probably intuitive to you, whoever they're saying this to. And often this is treated as though there's some sort of extra psychological fact of the matter about which sorts of positions are sort of intrinsically intuitive or counterintuitive, plausible or implausible, reasonable or not reasonable, without an appreciation for a couple things. One, that's nonsense. Something can only be reasonable or unreasonable, counterintuitive or intuitive from a point of view, from a perspective, given the psychological facts, the epistemic status, and so on, of a particular agent judging the situation. Now, you could make population level claims. You could say, typically a well-informed person would have this intuition rather than that intuition. Or you could say, given the way that human psychology typically operates, most people would find this intuitive rather than that. There's nothing incorrect about saying that, but if that's what's being asserted, it's not at all clear that that's what's being asserted. So, at least one issue with the way that philosophers proceed with their practice is that many times they make presumptions about how non-philosophers think, and they just don't test those claims. I don't want to get into that too much, though. I want to get back to the Nathan remark. Okay. So, Magnum Opus says, thanks. What's funny is that I've seen a lot of philosophers say that what the folk think is irrelevant to the big, spooky metaphysical discourse. I feel gaslit almost. So, I tend to be wary of terms like gaslight. I think that there's been a bit of concept creep where that tends to get overused. I see gaslighting as this sort of deliberate manipulation, like trying to convince someone that their perceptions and way of seeing reality is completely misguided for the purposes of controlling and manipulating that person. I don't think philosophers are intentionally misleading people. I mean, there could be a malicious philosopher out there that's like, I'm going to weave a bunch of nonsense philosophy in order to trick people. But for the most part, I think people are inducted into the philosophical canon and the traditions and educations of the field. And I think that the field has some methodological issues, and I think philosophers simply inherit these. I think philosophers, generally speaking, want to get at the truth. I think many of them are really well informed to do a great job. I don't think I think that philosophers often do quite well in spite of what I take to be serious problems with philosophy as it serves as it sort of manifests in our academic institutions, and given the sort of inertial legacy of its particular history. In other words, I think we're saddled with a bunch of bad thinking. I think that generation after generation, we get stuck with that. And, I get stuck with it. We all get stuck with it. And so I think philosophers are doing actually quite awesome in spite of what I take to be pretty serious problems with the fields, with the field's sort of history. Almost wish there could be a sort of a fresh start or something. But that just doesn't seem to have happened. So regarding this particular thing about intuitions, that's a bit tricky. So, philosophers will both say that how people think about these issues is irrelevant, and they'll make claims in other contexts like this is the commonsensical view, or this is intuitive, and so on. Now, it doesn't have to be the same philosopher, and to try to be charitable to the point there, is that the common sense, or what's taken to be commonsensical or intuitive or whatever, might be taken to serve a little bit of an evidential role in philosophy. It might be sort of setting who we're going to say has the burden of proof. It might, serve as a little bit of evidence for one view rather than another view. It might help us fix what the subject matter is, or what the terms of the discussion are, or what the topic matter, like the subject matter is. So, like, discussions about morality are presumably not completely unrelated to everyday uses of terms, moral terminology. That would be really strange. Like, we're philosophers debating morality, and you ask what they're talking about. They're talking about like how to build a bridge. Like, you'd be like, what does that have to do with morality? And like, oh yeah, no, that's just how we use the terms. Like morals are bricks or steel or something. You'd be like, what are you talking about? Like, they're just taking words that already have a colloquial usage, and they're redeploying them in a way that just doesn't seem to share any context. That'd be really weird. And so, understanding how non-philosophers think about these sorts of things, and roughly how they use terminology, does strike me as deeply central to many, many, many philosophical enterprises. Now, in some cases, it might not be that important. So if you're doing philosophy of physics or philosophy of biology or something like that, if you're dealing with like the special sciences, they have their own technical sort of structured jargon that's not a feature of everyday discourse. If you're talking about natural selection, that is not a colloquial term. It's a technical term that's used in biology. So it might not be an issue there, but in ethics, at least, it's going to be a big issue. How people speak and think and what they mean kind of does matter. It's just a question of how it matters and what way it matters. Does it serve an evidential role? If so, how much of an evidential role? But when philosophers say it's irrelevant, it's not clear to me what exactly they mean. In some respects, it might be irrelevant, and in others, it's not. Like many things, it's complicated. Okay. All right, so let's get back to this. So some time ago now, like 30 something minutes ago, I read my remark. I didn't like how I read it. So I'm gonna go ahead and reread it, and that'll help refresh people on what I was saying. So here's what I said. I'm so fed up with contemporary philosophy, I think I need an extended break. Its problems are too obvious, too severe, too ubiquitous, too tedious to point out for doing so to be the solution. It seems more like a religion composed of convoluted dogmas than a serious academic discipline. After having someone tell me I simply must, and in fact do believe precisely the nonsense of endeavor to diagnose or critique for over a decade, I've simply had enough for now. If philosophy instills in its adherents the profound arrogance to believe that they can determine how other people in fact think from the armchair, I want no part of it. Questions about what people think are questions for psychology. Philosophers constantly gripe about science encroaching on its territory, but philosophers consistently have few qualms about making sweeping claims about how people speak, think, and act, and what the world must be like, all by using inscrutable methods that don't require them to so much as walk outside or talk to someone who doesn't have the same education and training they do. I'm just tired of it. I need to break a damn long one. Now, clearly, I'm not taking a break, so I'm not following my own advice. But, one of the things that will happen, and part of the reason I digressed for 30 something minutes to talk about dual process models and that sort of thing, is that philosophers will think things like, because the way that we speak and think is driven by an implicit commitment to certain sorts of philosophical principles, they might think that because philosophically speaking, that it A entails B, that if a person thinks A, the person must believe B. So one example of this is, I did a couple posts on this a few weeks ago, probably about a month or so ago. JP Andrew posts frequently on Twitter. And one of the things that JP Andrew stresses, because I argue that most people are not moral realists, is that Andrew and other people have said, well, most people are theists, and since theism, is closely associated with, or some people would even say, I don't think Andrew says this, entails moral realism, most people are realists. Now, I did write a critique of that, but the bottom line is the mere fact that someone is a theist does not entail or tell you much about whether the person directly is a moral realist. The association between being a theist and being a moral realist is an empirical question. It's not something you could determine from the armchair. Now, you could say, but it's part of the sort of scriptural foundation of Christianity that there are objective moral, a couple billion people are Christians. Those people are, for the most part, moral realists. It doesn't follow. Take like the specific doctrines of Catholicism. If a person says, I'm a Catholic, does that mean they endorse all of those doctrines? No. In fact, we even have survey data on this. If you ask people about abortion, like Catholics, they're not all going to say abortion is morally wrong in accordance with the Catholic Church's official position. Because someone identifies with a religion, it does not follow that they endorse all of the doctrines of that religion. And likewise, it doesn't follow that if P entails Q, that if a person believes P, they must believe Q. And in fact, as a matter of empirical fact, do so. People are not logic bots. They don't just believe in accordance with whatever you think the rules of logic are. And if you think they do, that's an empirical question. You would have to provide empirical evidence that that's true. But philosophers don't do that. Some of them will just presume, well, this is logically entailed, so they must believe it. You might even think it's just what it means to believe something is to believe its entailments. And that I find to be really bizarre and strange. So philosophers, because of the way that they think about philosophy, often this leads them to think that they're in a position to say, this is how people think. This is what people think. This is what people mean when they say certain sorts of things. As if this could be determined from the armchair. It can't be. That's human reasoning does not have to comport with the consistency, like philosophical consistency. It doesn't have to comport with the ideals and norms of analytic philosophy. It doesn't have to conform with classical logic. It doesn't mean that if a person makes an argument that the person has some implicit syllogism in mind. Human reasoning and judgment does not necessarily correspond with the sort of a formalization of abstract philosophical thinking and reasoning. It's just there's that. And if you think it does, that is an empirical question that you'd have to show empirical evidence for. And philosophers just don't do this. So that's really, really frustrating. So here's what Nathan said. And this is on Twitter. I'll post it in the chat so you could have a look. Nathan said, I spent so much intellectual effort and time studying and learning about philosophy, and I'm pretty convinced the field is systematically flawed, mostly pointless, and riddled with confusions. That's really sad and difficult to deal with, to be honest. Won't get 4 years of study back. So Nathan here seems to be expressing regret for spending 4 years studying philosophy, only to judge that it is so flawed that it's unclear that that it was worth it. And one of the things that this got me thinking is, how many people are sort of ex-philosophers? They start studying philosophy and then they realize it's not for them for reasons like this. So I am very sympathetic to what Nathan says here. I think that academic philosophy as it's practiced has massive methodological problems. I think it has huge flaws. I'm very much in the Wittgenstein camp that I think many of these problems are driven by missteps related to language, and that a great deal of philosophy is a byproduct of conceptual and linguistic confusions, that were philosophers to take a more Wittgensteinian approach, they would recognize that many of these problems are really pseudo problems that can be dissolved through a careful understanding of the underlying language and the way that we're thinking about these problems. So I take that perspective. I think Wittgenstein dealt a massive uppercut to the field. And I think that some philosophers recognize that. But, I don't know how many left the field as a result. I don't know how many are like, oh no, this is ruining something I love doing, let me ignore it. And how many just disagree with Wittgenstein. I think it's mostly probably the latter. Unfortunately, I don't think that that's had as lasting or as significant an impact on the field as it should, even though Wittgenstein is often heralded as one of the most prominent and important and influential philosophers, not only of the 20th century, but of all time. And it still hasn't, totally altered the field. So that tweet ended up getting 116,000 views. It got a lot of reactions. And, I don't want to go through them all, but, some of them are quite interesting. But what stood out to me is that many people seem to have a supportive reaction to that. Now, when I get critical of philosophy, I often get pushback, I often get a lot of negative feedback. But, one possibility is that uh, a big factor in why philosophy has the problems that it has and why it's not able to make progress is that if people that take a critical approach, like Nathan does, like I do, people that think that many of the problems are pseudo problems, are demoralized and discouraged from continuing in the field because it just so many of the people in the field are deeply invested in and committed to asking questions in a way that we might think is flawed, in pursuing those questions using methods that we think are ill-conceived, in relying on presuppositions or a dogmatic adherence to certain sorts of principles, beliefs, or attitudes that we don't share and that we think are misguided or mistaken. Then, the field itself is just too many people doing things continue within that field. And you might think there's something wrong with this. Forget it. I'm leaving. And then you just go do something else. Now, if the whole field is like that, whenever someone shows up that could try to fix it, they could just see that things aren't working well and they leave. So you could think, I'm trying to think like, imagine you wanted to join a club because you're really interested in the topic and you show up and everybody's like, let's say it's I don't know, a baking club. You want to learn how to make really good bread. And you show up and people are screaming at each other and they're fighting and you see all the bread is burning and they're all just, it seems really unpleasant and toxic and there's trash everywhere and no one's cleaning it up. You're not going to stick around with that club. You're going to leave. And so the only people that would stick around would be the people that are like, they show up and they're like, yeah, this is good. This is fine. This is my kind of atmosphere. And they get right to yelling at people and burning bread along with them. And so philosophy might have this sort of a magnetic attraction to people that tend to think in accordance with the prevailing mainstream methods and presuppositions within the field, and to have an associated sort of repulsion effect for people that might be critical of those methods. Now, it could be that the methods that it's using are perfectly fine and that it's healthy and it's on track and it's doing what it should be doing. But if it's not, it might be really, really, really hard to fix it. And part of the reason why is that unlike other fields, let's say engineers, and I know I give these examples a lot, but let's say engineers, the bridges all started collapsing, sewer systems weren't working well, roads were crumbling, buildings are falling down, and this is happening all over the place. We might think, okay, there's something wrong with the way people are being taught to do engineering. There would be this external recognizable consequence of people doing it badly. Even in some cases where there's a great deal of subjectivity, if we kept seeing awful art, we might think there's something wrong with art. And I think some people would say that is the case with a great deal of modern art. It's like so minimalistic and so meaningless and empty that it's not very good. Or, if you went to a restaurant and the food is bad, you go on Yelp and you see, yeah, the food here is not good. And people stop going and they go out of business. So there's also all these sort of natural ways of noticing problems in other areas, in the culinary world, the restaurant industry, in art, in engineering, medicine. If people are going to, if everybody in the hospital just died, people are going to be concerned about what's going on in the hospital and on the quality of the medical training that people working there are receiving. How would we notice if philosophers were being taught really to do philosophy in a really terrible way, and that most of the stuff they were writing as a result wasn't getting us anywhere, wasn't very helpful, wasn't getting anything done, and was just riddled with confusions? Well, it's not obvious from the outside. You're not going to see bridges collapse. You're not going to see people dying of diseases. You're not going to see that the food isn't getting produced at an adequate enough level to feed everybody. You're not going to notice these sorts of problems. And so if there are problems with philosophy's methods, it's not going to be obvious from the outside. So how would you find out? You have to get on the inside. You actually have to become a philosopher to really get a clear visceral sense of its problems. But if it has that repulsion effect where studying it is difficult, you go to your philosophy class and you think they're talking a bunch of nonsense. Well, if you're precisely the person that could learn it well enough to carefully point that out, why would you stick around to do that? Like if you went in a class and on astronomy and they were all doing like horoscopes and someone's like, I'm a Gemini and I'm a Sagittarius, you might think, oh my God, I don't know what happened in this astronomy class, but this is not for me because astrology is nonsense. And you would leave. And there wouldn't be people that could effectively point out that astronomy is not about horoscopes to point it out, because they left and they went and you did some other job. So my concern is that it's to a certain extent, philosophy is a bit of a black box to outsiders. It's opaque. There's not really a good way of judging the merits of philosophy without literally just becoming a philosopher, because its fruits are, to the extent that it has them, so hard to evaluate, so hard to see from the outside. That this makes it this problem makes it very, very difficult. Now, one consequence of that is that I think on some level, a lot of people outside of philosophy do have this sense that there's something wrong with it and that it has problems, but they don't know what those problems are exactly. And I think a lot of the criticisms that you get of philosophy are quite bad. Okay. Oh, so Nathan showed up. Digital Gnosis is here. You watching Joe's thingy thing? I already watched it and I was planning on doing a reaction to it. If you want to come on the stream, I'm going to take a little break and then come back, and then I was going to play it. If you want to come on the stream, let me know, because we could both react to it together. That would be cool. Yeah, and it seems like a total coincidence that it came out, because I think it's related to this is Joe over at Majesty of Reason. Oh, great. So Nathan says I can come on, sure. So that's going to be in about 10 or 15, because I want to get people updated. Is that okay? Is that cool with you? Because I know it might be a little late for you. I don't know. As long as as long as it looks fine, then that's okay. I don't mind if you're in bed. Mind me being in bed, haha. Okay, great. So I'll kick it into gear to get to there in about 10 or 15. Oh, right. So Ko Matsuda says, hi, Lance, I love your videos. Do you feel there's any connection between your ideas you study and the way you live your daily life? That's an interesting question. Absolutely. So my personality outside of these videos, I think, is actually kind of similar to my personality here. It's one thing that I wanted to mention, because there's a funny case of another person accusing me of lying about my philosophical views, which is that I've thought about having my wife show up and be like, no, Lance talks about this stuff like 24/7 outside of videos and blogging and all that stuff. So just the point there is that, like, I'll be in bed and I'll be like, the intuitions, the moral realism. So she's probably already had enough of it. But like, the point would just be, like, if I was making up my philosophical views, like my view that certain concepts that non-naturalist realists use in metaethics are not meaningful. If I was making that up, like, I'm super committed to the lie, because I'm like keeping it up in private conversations and like with my friends and family. Like, it would be a really bizarre way for me to live my life. But yeah, I remember I once asked my students in a class I was teaching what motivates them. And then I said, you know what motivates me? And I realized when I asked the question that I didn't know the answer to it. And so I was like, you know what motivates me? Anger. So it was just, my candid response was anger. That's what gets me fired up. So for me, I've also made this distinction between destructive and constructive philosophy. I think Dan Dennett mentioned this and said, yeah, some people do constructive, some people do destructive, some people do both. I can't remember exactly what Dennett said about that. But I am self-conscious of the fact that I tend to do more destructive philosophy and less constructive philosophy. But I do think destructive philosophy is really important. And so there's a lot of things that make me angry. I'm kind of a grumpy person. And one of the things you could do with that is you could just succumb to it and be angry all the time, which I guess I am. But what I try to do is channel my frustrations. Like, I try to turn them into some sort of useful energy that I could then utilize and do something with. And that's, I think, why I do destructive philosophy, that I take my anger and frustration out on what I take to be flawed methods. And this naturally transported over into my work in psychology as well, where I critique a lot of psychological methods. So that's something I could develop on another time. I want to talk, maybe I'll just have to do another stream to talk about some of the other stuff that I wanted to talk about. But yeah, so Nathan shared that post, and we did a video. I don't know how many of you saw that video, but we talked for, I think, a couple hours. Maybe it was too much, because I think we could have made the point probably in 30 minutes that we wanted to make. We were talking about the problems that we have with philosophy. Also, there was someone that gave a really good summary of the problems, but I didn't ask them if it would be cool for me to share that. So I will have to dig that up and talk about it another time. We'll have plenty of times to do that. But someone was asked, like, what are my concrete issues with academic philosophy? And someone gave this summarized list that I thought perfectly encapsulated the particular issues that I had. So I'll reach out to them and say, hey, is it cool if I share this list with everybody? So you could get a concrete, really concise, summarized list of the particular sorts of concerns that I have. I'm not even going to try to deal with that now. Oh, right. Oh, I should also talk about a few other things. I also ran a survey in the community section here on whether people think philosophy is a waste of time or not. So let me go pull that up and see the results. I didn't check the sort of final results, so I'm going to pull those up now. Let's see what those results were. Okay, is philosophy a waste of time? I got 81% saying no and 19% saying yes with 118 votes. So thank you for everybody that voted. That's quite a bit of votes, especially for this channel. So I really appreciate everybody voting. That's awesome. So it looks like 4 to 5 people said, yeah, philosophy is not a waste of time. So my answer to is philosophy a waste of time is, in fact, no, I don't think it's a waste of time. But I think a great deal of philosophy is probably a waste of time. And I guess that's something that we'll get into when we're reviewing the video. Okay, so what else did I want to go over today? Let's see. There's a couple other things I wanted to mention. Yeah, so there's some stuff on illusionism and consciousness, but I think that's a big enough topic that I'll shift to covering that in another stream, either later this week or like in the future. So I'll push that off for now. But yeah, there's some interesting stuff there. And I know I haven't talked about consciousness a lot here, so that's something that I should do a bit more of. So the one thing I wanted to mention, yeah, I posted like 50 things on illusionism, was I got this remark, and it was under a debate that I had with Eric Sampson last year. And that was, Eric Sampson's a moral realist. We had a discussion about moral realism and anti-realism. And one of the things that I was arguing back then, and I continue to argue now, so my view hasn't really changed on the matter, is that certain concepts that are employed by non-naturalist realists, I think are unintelligible. I think that they don't mean anything. And in particular, I have in mind Parfit's notion of an external reason. So this is a reason that counts in favor of something, like counts in favor of performing an action that isn't reducible to your desires. So you have a reason not to, say, perform some action like touch a hot stove, regardless of whether it would be consistent with your desires or not. I think that's meaningless. I don't. What are these reasons? How does one have a reason? How does a fact give a reason? I can make sense of reasons in the relevant contexts if they are understood in terms of some sort of consistency between what would promote certain goals or desires or actions, but I don't know what it would mean otherwise. And it's not simply matter. This is important to stress, that simply because I don't know what it means, therefore it doesn't mean anything. That's not the inference procedure. I think that because I do know what these terms could mean, that if someone's using them in some other way and they reliably are not able to communicate what they mean, it's an inductive inference. If someone says, I have, there's an animal in this box, and you go through the whole list of animals and it's not any of those animals. And you say, well, is it any other? And maybe it's some animal you've never heard of. If their description systematically stripped whatever it is they're describing from having any at all communicable properties until it's just this mysterious thing, like Wittgenstein's beetle in the box, it's no longer clear to me whether they're talking about anything substantive at all. So it's partially an inductive inference that I'm arriving at, but it's also something like, I think sometimes in virtue of having a good understanding of things, you can understand why something couldn't be the case. So for instance, if you do understand math, you can understand why 12 isn't a prime number. Now, if someone doesn't understand what the rules are governing what is or isn't a prime number, and you say, hey, could 12 be a prime number? The person might go, yeah, I think I can imagine 12 being a prime number. I can't imagine 12 being a prime number. But that's not because of my ignorance, it's because of my lack of ignorance. And so if I think certain terms are meaningless, it's not necessarily because of my ignorance. It could be because of my lack of ignorance. And I think the same applies here. So here's what this person said, because I've articulated this concern that certain realist concepts are not meaningful. Is they said the following: pretending what moral realists are saying is pure gibberish is super bad faith and immature. Stuff like that might fly on Less Wrong and YouTube comment sections, but it sounds ridiculous in actual debates with academics. So I don't even know what to say about this. I don't know, because I've gotten these kinds of comments before. I have thought, like, is this person joking? Like, are they just sort of trying to encapsulate all the sorts of things people have said that are really implausible? But yeah, saying it's bad faith and immature. So first, regarding bad faith. So bad faith would imply that I'm somehow being like disingenuous. I am being very genuous. I really think that these terms and concepts are not meaningful. This is not something I'm pretending. So, right. And then also notice that they said pretending. I'm not pretending. This is not like, I don't understand why, if someone thinks that my view, like if they think I'm wrong, why not say that I'm wrong? You could say I'm confused, I'm stupid, I'm ignorant, I haven't thought about this well, I don't understand the topic. Why go for bad faith and pretending like I would make up my position? It's very strange. And I think there's something to that. I think my concern is, if a person didn't have good objections, one thing they might accuse you of is lying. So, for me, I take this maybe as some evidence that there's not really a good response to this, because if there was a good response, why not just give that instead of accusing me of lying? Um, and then the other thing, immature. So I've given quotes on this channel before from Bernard Williams. So it's right in On What Matters, Volume 2, page 272, where Williams calls external reasons unintelligible explicitly and directly. And Parfit addresses this, discusses it, and takes it seriously. Now, Parfit doesn't agree with Williams, but Parfit takes it seriously. Now, is Williams immature? Williams is an academic. Is it immature for Williams to raise this concern? R.M. Hare, J.L. Mackey attributes similar concerns to R.M. Hare. Page, I think, 21 of the 77 version of Mackey's Ethics and Inventing Right and Wrong. Mackey says R.M. Hare says he doesn't know what people are talking about when they talk about morality being objective, and doesn't know anybody that does. Is Hare being immature? Is it ridiculous for Hare to make that sort of claim? I mean, if you could say it is ridiculous, okay, but the way that this is presented is as though academics wouldn't say this, just some immature idiot pretender liar or something on Less Wrong or something like that, someone that's not in a serious academic discussion. This is a serious academic position. It's a position that has been taken by serious academics, and I am also an academic working on this topic, so I take it seriously. Now, if other people don't want to take it seriously, maybe that's because it's not worth taking it seriously, or maybe it's because they're wrong and they don't, it could be that it's worth taking seriously and they're very misguided about the matter. So, I wanted to share that because, I have mentioned that people will say that I'm lying or pretending to like think that certain concepts in philosophy are unintelligible. They might wonder, does anyone really say this? The answer is yes, they do. Yeah, they really do say these sorts of things. They'll say that I'm pretending to have my views. It's the same thing with illusionism. So I'll claim that I don't have intuitions, that I have qualia or phenomenal states, and people will just be incredulous and say, how could that possibly be? And so this is one of those cases. There's other cases, where people will tell me I'm pretending or lying, that I must think this, that I do think that. It's really strange, and I don't know what to make of that. Okay, so I'm going to take a quick break, and then I'll come back and we'll bring Nathan on here. And okay, so I will be right back in a couple minutes. Okay, so I am back. Let me send an invite over to Nathan. And I haven't streamed a video on here before. So I will see if I can figure out how to do that. All right. Let's see. It looks like that's working. Yeah, that looks good. Cool. All right. What's up?
I'm all right. Like terrible. Let me just check. Is that audio okay?
Yeah, the audio is actually perfect. So, I mean,
Okay,
for
great.
me at least.
Okay, great. Just because it's just the laptop mic, so I don't know if it was any good, but
All right. So let's see. You had said a few things. I don't know if you're caught up. I ended up going on this long thing about moral cognition for no reason. That's what I do on my stream. I just ramble. Uh, all right. So you said we can talk about bright green reasons and all nod our heads. See, this is what a lot of it sounds like to me. It's so weird. One of the weirdest things about the stuff that I think may or may not be unintelligible, and I could just be wrong about this, is if it's so intelligible, why don't the proponents of these ideas just explain what they mean? And why are the reactions that they give when I ask them to explain what they mean like really weird and defensive and sometimes passive aggressive? So, why give me, so for instance, what do you mean by X? And you get a runaround. Well, it means Y. Okay, what do you mean by that? Well, it just means X. Well, I understand it's incommunicable and I can't tell you. Why not just start with that? And I think it's a sort of throwaway line. They're just hoping you'll shut up. Kind of like when you ask a question at a Q&A to like some Christian apologist and they just say a bunch of bullshit because they know, well, I shouldn't say they know. I don't have telepathy. They'll say a bunch of bullshit and a lot of people hear it and go, yeah, it sounds good. As long as you give some answer. But you might sound like an idiot if you just go, I don't know. you know? So I think people kind of give these sort of decoy responses, hoping most people will shut up and accept them. And then if you question them on that, they've sort of discharged their social responsibility to give an answer. So now they can act like you're an asshole if you keep asking. So you say, what's an X? It's a Y. What's a Y? It's a Z. What's a Z? Oh, come on now. I've already answered you. And it's like, you didn't get me anywhere. So that's not helpful. But then you look like a jerk for continuing to press them. I don't know if you've had that experience.
I've not had that experience that you're describing, right? But I think that our approaches are a little bit different sometimes. And maybe the way that we'd characterize some of these problems is maybe there's like a slight difference there that leads to slightly different approaches. I tend to think that for a lot of the people who talk like this, they're just so deep down the rabbit hole that they do think that it's just a normal way of speaking now. So, for example, I think that people who have spent so much time doing philosophy, the way that they talk about knowledge, I think this is more like the intro level people, and then you get, at the higher levels, you get people talk about reasons and things like that. But I think still the way that they use these words just gets changed from the way that normal people would use them or think about them, such that they think their way of talking about them is the normal one now. So that, like if you listen to any sort of philosophy bro Discord channel chat about something and someone uses the word knowledge and they'll be like, oh, so you think you have knowledge? And already in that like have knowledge, they're talking about as if like there's a kind of special type of property that confers knowledge on someone's mental state rather than, just mere belief or something, rather than the more ordinary sense of the word knowledge where someone just means, like I'm really, really, really confident in this, and no one's surprised in trying to figure out the metaphysics of knowledge or something. Like, how can it be that someone can truly use the word knowledge but be wrong in some cases or something like that? Like, how could I even make sense of a case like that? And I think that similar sort of thing just happens with all these other discourses, right? Where you end up with, I agree, when people talk about reasons and things in certain ways, it's like they're just throwing random adjectives in there that don't go together in the right way. But for them, I think that that feeling of inappropriateness in the grammar has gone away because they've, because they've socialized themselves into that so much. And now, from my point of view, if what they were doing were to catch on, right, or be very useful for something, then maybe I'd accept it too. But I think what the question becomes is, well, what's this different type of discourse useful for? And usually the answer is to try and make me look smart or something, something like that. And it doesn't actually do anything then, like sort of almost prescribing this different and niche way of using these terms to the kind of ordinary normal sense that might be more polissiment, it might be less rigid, it might have less sharp edges, or it might, but at least that kind of ordinary sense is deployed by most people to make up the world. I think if you're prescribing some kind of linguistic reform or something, you've got to there's got to be some good upshot to that kind of reform, right? Whether it's like encouraging actual social change, so like a more just world or something, or whether it's like scientific change, like now we've refined our categories in a certain way, and this less confused way of thinking about it helps us to have less people die of diseases or something, right? So there are cases where linguistic reform, like, yeah, I'm all right for, but the majority of the cases where philosophers are encouraging or prescribing linguistic reform, then I'm kind of like, no, this is just like your weird niche way of using the words that doesn't have a benefit, really.
I pulled up this paper while you were saying that. Have you seen this? Expert or esoteric philosophers attribute knowledge differently than all other academics.
Right.
And what they show here is empirical research actually supporting what you're saying. That
Right.
This is not idle speculation. Philosophers speak and think in ways that are idiosyncratic.
I've not actually read this, so I'm just searching it now because it looks pretty cool.
Yeah, so I'm sharing it with everybody so that they could see. I'll post a link in the chat. But so you said initially that our approach is different, but that's actually very similar to one of the sort of central pillars of the way that I approach these things as well.
When I say different, sorry, I think we're like broadly in agreement on a lot of things. What I mean is, I think our way of approaching the problem, like maybe the way that we confront it in dialogue with other people, is like slightly different, and maybe that's like temperament driven, or maybe, I don't know, I'm just like a jaded asshole who doesn't care that much at the minute or something, like, whereas I think you're very invested in trying to put together this really good case and bring people around to your point of view on this and stuff, right? That's what I see, at least. I could be wrong about
Fair
that.
enough. Fair enough. So did you watch the Joe's video yet?
I did, but there's like almost I don't know, 1/3 of it ish, 2/3 maybe, is this Graham Priest video. I say Graham Hancock, not Graham Hancock, the ancient pyramids guy. Graham Priest, the logician. A video of him. I don't know where the clip's taken from, but it was on. I watched that about 2 or 3 years ago on Philosophy Overdose. Like, what's the purpose of philosophy? And he talks about a bunch of times when philosophical ideas intersected with certain things that are happening historically as a kind of justification for why philosophy is important. But I think that that's one way of interpreting that evidence. And my view has been, especially as I've become, what should I say, like more educated in the particular historical, lots of the particular historical things he's pointing to, is more that a lot of these things that have happened politically, economically, or in the physical sciences have kind of happened for independent reasons. So either because something's been invented, or maybe there's like political social change or material conditions that mean that people are motivated in certain ways. Things happen, and then there just happen to be philosophers around who kind of are caught up in that wave of stuff happening, and then they just talk about it as if it's all to do, like, because they're interested in it, sure, but then they kind of retrospectively characterize the movements that are happening as if it's all caused by their thought. So to give some specific examples, maybe if you think of things around the Enlightenment, there weren't actually that many thinkers who were these kind of like secular thinkers who were really, right? Instead, there was a lot of like political stuff happening, and then there were a few people who were sitting around kind of thinking about, well, does God really exist? Can we question things philosophically in this different way? But if you look at the history then through the lens of the way that a lot of philosophers will look at that period of history, they'll be like, yeah, these few philosophers are really driving ideological change in Europe. And then you see, and you see a lot of that stuff happen when it comes to like the application of logic to computer science. It's like, oh, the power of computers, that's clearly must be related to some of the changes that were going on in logic a bit before then. But actually, if you really try and connect those dots, it's quite difficult to do so. Instead, you see things like, the war driving the need for technological reform at a greater pace and things like that. And then just it happens to be that philosophers are around at the time, and maybe a few things are a little bit associated. So I don't want to make like some generalization that philosophy's had no connection to any of these things, but I think that philosophers have like a kind of fan fiction version of a lot of this history, where they really overstate the case for how important people kind of idly speculating on things has been for a lot of that kind of change and drive and things.
Yeah, that's it. I haven't heard anyone raise that particular concern before. If I'm understanding you, it's that you're part of what you're suggesting is that philosophers seem to weave this narrative that philosophical insights and philosophical work has played an important, even central causal role in certain aspects of historical development. And in fact, those philosophers are just sort of articulating and repackaging ideas that are circulating that are a product of the times and conditions in which they live.
Yeah, and or like a better explanation, that there are better explanations for why those things are happening that lie outside of the kind of a philosopher speculated about it, and then that happened to drive this person's ideas. Instead, it seems like those things are happening, and then philosophers are just thinking about the implications of these new technologies or these new political movements,
Yeah.
because philosophers like to think about things and write about them, right? But then when philosophers come along and look at history through the lens of all their favorite philosophers, they're like, oh wow, look, really it was the philosophers who were driving this change and that change and that change. It's like, wow, yeah, maybe it's a bit less, maybe there's a bit less of a connection or a bit less of an impact than that.
They might also claim that philosophy has been central in birthing the sciences. What about that?
Yeah, I think that's, again, it's going to be a really complicated historical story, I think, right? And one that I'm probably not qualified to give a complete, like, I don't know that I know enough to give a complete analysis. But again, from the bit I know that it's not simply, it was difficult when you say the sciences. What do you mean? Do you mean like thinking about things a little bit empirically? But I mean, it's hard to deny that there's some relationship. Obviously, there have been people who would consider themselves to be doing philosophy who have been involved in the sciences, but then there's also a lot of people who have been very skeptical of the role of theory and done more practical things. And then it's their inventions that have kind of either driven the way that theory's gone or the way that people think about things. And I think it's going to be a difficult, complicated story to tell, right? About like why we ended.
So I turned it off to see what would happen, and then it just got real weird when I started talking. Anyway, so I think that historical approach is interesting, and like you, I don't think I know enough to really make it like that'd be like a big research project, like a really big research.
Yeah, for
project.
sure.
Yes,
but
that,
so like
that
I made a lot of vague generalizations there, right, as well. But I'm just saying I think there's something on a lot of these topics that'd be cool to look into more. I should caveat, like I've got some opinions about some things, but I think that should be looked into by
that helps us move into something I want to address before we get to this video. And if you want to skip the Grand Prix stuff and just cover some of the stuff at the beginning, maybe the end, maybe we'll do that.
Sounds good.
I want to respond to the pre stuff too, so maybe I'll go back and do that. I don't know if you head out. In any case, although maybe it's weird not to go through it sequentially, so we'll see, and we'll see what you're up for. But one of the things I want to emphasize, because I know that I've been on this sort of this anti-philosophy what do they call them? ARC, like a lot of
Crusades.
anti-philosophy. Huh?
Crusade.
Oh, well, I mean, what I mean is, I've talked a lot of moral realism stuff, and then I've shifted a lot. Like in the last few weeks, it hasn't been quite as much moral realism. It's been more, is
Okay.
philosophy useless? And then
Hero.
like broader general complaints about philosophy and its norms. So like a lot of the stuff has been on consciousness stuff. So like one of the things that really bothered me, I got to talk about this in another stream, is when people will critique illusionism by saying, well, if it's an illusion, well, it couldn't be an illusion unless you were conscious of the illusion.
Yeah,
like,
an illusion is a type of conscious state. Yeah, that's it.
And it's like, well, a couple things. One is, are you seriously critiquing a position on the basis of a superficial interpretation of the meaning of the name of the position? Because you could just call the position anti-phenomenalism or something like that, or anti-Cartesian theorism, something like that. Like then it wouldn't be obvious that you could make this criticism, because it's not a legitimate criticism. The view is not saying people have the phenomenal experience of not having phenomenal experience. Like it's not just internally.
I thought the position was that people have Cartesian souls that are experiencing an illusion, but they think that illusion. I'm being really sarcastic, by the way, Lance.
Yeah. So I would basically describe the view as and actually Dennett has qualified his position on this too, but it's not exactly this, but it's roughly that people think they have phenomenal states, they don't have phenomenal states. That's the view. So if you're rejecting, so like something like qualia quietism just holds that the idea of a phenomenal state isn't meaningful. And so part of what, it's not really worth getting into too much of it, but the idea is that there is a certain way in which people can report on, structure, talk about, think about, and believe about what their conscious experience is like. So an example I might give is when people are like, look out on a visual scene, they think that they have rich, detailed color vision in their entire field of view. They don't. They're wrong about that. And so they might tell you it really seems that way. And we know that it's not that way. It's demonstrably not that way. And so in that sense, there's a certain degree of illusion to our visual perception. Now, that illusion is people think things are one way and they're not really that way. But them thinking it's one way and not really being that way. Yeah. So thinking doesn't have to be construed in terms of phenomenal states. And so if a person thinks something is true, like a person assents to the truth of the proposition that their experiential states have certain sorts of content and they don't really have that content, that person is subject to that extent to a certain type of illusion. And if there is a systematic shared way in which people think that their experience of reality, for instance, they think that they're seeing and touching and tasting and smelling everything in a sort of simultaneous center, how things seem to them isn't really how things are. But the way in which they seem to them on the illusionist view can be understood in completely functionalist terms, like what they would report, what they would say when asked, how they would act. It doesn't require phenomenal states. And so saying that they're presupposing phenomenal states and denying phenomenal states is just really just goofy. It's stupid. Of course they don't think that. And it's such a bad criticism, and yet people make it anyway. Philip Goff just said it is a bad criticism. So credit to Goff for saying that.
Wait, is he in the chat or something? Or
no, he said this on Facebook. He responded after I complained about this saying, yeah, it's a bad criticism. So right on. Yeah. Okay, should we just get into the Joe video? I feel like oh, no, sorry. There was another thing I wanted to mention. It's really important to set the stage for this anti-philosophy arc, which is that I am not anti-philosophy. I don't think all philosophy is useless. I'm very disappointed with the state of academic philosophy, even though I think some portions of academic philosophy are awesome and super cool and super interesting. I think that the field has too much of a tolerance for all the bad philosophy that is circulating in the field. And I wish the field could be better. I also think a lot of what philosophy could be is super exciting and interesting and awesome. And I'm just disappointed with how it manifests in practice. But what I am very much not is one of these people that have not studied much philosophy and they're in like the STEM fields, like, I don't know, biology or physics or something. And then they are sitting on their like science pedestal saying, philosophy's stupid. It's useless. It doesn't do anything. We build space rockets. What do? They just talk about Socrates. They're a bunch of idiots. I don't have that perspective. I don't have this sort of naive philosophy is crap.
You mean scientismists?
Yeah, so there's a certain degree of scientism that I might be okay with, but not a sort of full-blown all philosophy is garbage and like science is the only way to do things. I'm not on board with that. So I just want to make that clear. And I don't know if you have thoughts on that too. And then we'll get started.
No, I do. I agree that there are those people out there, and I do think that that can be a pretty silly view. But then I think that what happens is that people kind of point to that lazy, almost like caricature as a position that someone like you or I would adopt when we have legitimate criticisms. And I think I almost wish those people wouldn't do it, because then they might see these stronger objections to that point of view that aren't just this kind of like lazy, oh no, bro, like I know about evolution, therefore I don't need to think anymore. Like,
oh God, yeah. You know, I see apologists criticize what atheists say and do in a lot of contexts. And there's a reflexive part of me that wants to say, like, atheists will say stuff like, there's no evidence for God. And then, like, I want to say, no one thinks that, but they do say that. And it does bother me, because what do you mean by no evidence? So there's a lot of stuff that, you know, I'll see people say in the apologetics community where, you know, I'm on the atheist side as far as positions go, but then in terms of actually watching the conduct of atheists in comment
you want to
sections,
actually be not on their side because it's so silly. Right. Also, yeah.
It's like a lot of the people that will just be like, evolution. I've talked to people about it. That like, so I did this thing. I call it Socratizing. I would go around dressed like a philosopher, like in robes, and I would ask people questions. I didn't always ask philosophy questions. One question I would ask people is, can you describe what natural selection is? I probably asked a few dozen, maybe over 100 people that. I don't think I ever got a good answer to that question. And I think the same thing would happen if I went to like an atheist club and I said, what's natural selection? I think a lot of them just couldn't tell you at all.
Yeah. But then I find it so weird that people are so confident when their sort of thoughts about these things are so empty. But I mean, I guess that's a whole different thing. But I do think there's something that I think could be going on here. And it's something that I only just discovered recently. Actually, it's a psychological finding that does replicate very well, called the immunization effect, right? And it's basically when people are exposed to weaker versions of objections to their views prior to being exposed to stronger objections to their views, then it's actually harder for them to sort of like move their belief in light of those like new disconfirming reasons, even when they're presented with those good reasons, because if they were first presented with bad reasons. I think there's something like that going on when people who are quite into philosophy, for example, encounter the like just really uncritical, almost like almost just like emoting about disliking philosophy, but not really having understood what it is that they object to. And then I think it makes it harder going forward to listen to like legitimate objections of the field, right? Or it makes it easier to just ignore those objections and imagine that the people raising them are just a part of this other group or something. And I do think the same thing can happen, obviously, you know, for myself and positions I dislike, like maybe theism or something like that. But in this case, I do see it happening with the people who are like really into philosophy, right? Where they're just kind of stereotyping or something based off of having seen these weaker set of arguments before.
Yeah, so I haven't personally checked like how well that data replicates. It is really plausible, and assuming that's a real effect, I do worry that this has happened with me. For some of the positions I take on things like the illusionist stuff, I tend to be in that camp. And I think part of it is it's not just that sort of inoculation effect from encountering bad arguments. It's also this kind of side of the underdog type thing, which I think I have a bias for in philosophy. Something about people misrepresenting and mischaracterizing illusionism.
Oh yeah,
and
it makes you get a bit,
yeah, I want to defend it, even if I don't endorse it. But I think that the very act of defending it disposes me towards believing it more and being more emotionally invested in it. And so I do actually think that over time, I've developed a kind of like pro-Dennett's philosophical perspective on consciousness bias because of constantly having to defend it against people misrepresenting it. One of the most common experiences with those sorts of critiques is that people will, I'll say, what of Dennett's work have you read? And the answer is usually very little, or like, I read 20 pages of Consciousness Explained and I decided it was stupid, which isn't to say that there aren't people that have read through the whole book carefully and come up with thoughtful criticisms. It's just that's not typically what I encounter. Anyway, should we play this video?
Yeah, let's do it.
Cool. Let's do it. First, let's do a check. Is because I haven't done this before on my channel. When I did this with Danny was playing this stuff. So let me know. Is the audio?
Did you click the checkbox for share audio when you click share?
I have no idea.
If you just
Let's
click
find out.
unshare at the bottom, oh yeah, just click play and I'll say yeah.
It's a good question and one that deserves a thoughtful.
Is it?
Yeah.
Does it work?
Working.
Cool.
Yeah.
And how is the audio on that? Is it sounding adequate?
Sounds fine. I think though, are you on the paid tier of StreamYard or the free tier of StreamYard? Because on the free tier, I think you do get some. On the stream, you get some audio like quality loss from sharing the video, but I think you'll be all right. So. Yeah.
Okay, so let's start it back from the beginning, and then what's the best way for you to let me know if you want to comment? Like,
I'll just make a noise or wave or something like that. Yeah,
let's do it. Yeah. Should I play it on like 1.5 or something?
I don't mind. It's a relatively short video, but yeah, 90 minutes. It could take a while, so yeah, maybe 1.5.
Yeah, let's. Sorry, I have my microphone in front of my face when I'm doing this. I'll do 1.25 just to make it a little faster.
Yeah, sounds good.
Is philosophy useless? It's a good question, and one that deserves a thoughtful answer. In this video, I'm going to explain why philosophy has quite significant and wide-ranging utility. But before getting to that, I want to note that regardless of whether philosophy is practically useful, I don't think the merits of a discipline or activity are determined by practical utility. Art, after all, isn't super practically useful, but it's a valuable expression of human creativity, ingenuity, insight, and experience.
If we just pause on that point, though, it's that practically useful. Like, I think that practical is a fairly ambiguous term, right? And in the case of art, I think there's a case to be made for it being practically useful, just in case a large number of people get that stuff that makes life meaningful out of it, right? like those good feelings or those profound, insightful kind of like feelings from seeing a good film or a good art piece, whatever. And then that's almost about as practical as it gets. aside from maybe like eating food together or something like that. You know, if you think about the core experiences of human life, the kind of deep, meaningful experiences of art, culture, religion, they're cross-culturally quite important things to people. And so I would argue that actually those are very practical in a way of understanding the word practical, right? And I think the problem is going to be that the idea of what's practical is going to be parasitic upon what you value or care about, basically. What is it you're trying to do in the world as an organism? And that is also going to mean that, well, philosophy can be practical insofar as you care or value about some of the things that it gives you or brings you, right? So I think then what the disagreement is going to come down to is whether there are like shared values or goals which are better satisfied by doing something else, or whether the vast majority of people find it not to satisfy things they value or have goals for, and so it shouldn't be valued by the people, like something like that, right? But I think that term practical is, and it's going to be too kind of like vague, right? So I disagree with that initial point that Joe's making.
Yeah, I could say something about that too. So I completely agree with that. And this question of practicality, I think if you disambiguated it, I think that the colloquial usage of practicality is in force here. And there's this, I think that the colloquial usage to food, that gets you shelter, that gives you your basic needs is practical. Something that pays the bills is practical. Something that sort of carries out the sort of necessities of life and makes them more efficient or streamlined, but is having a picnic or spending time with your family or having an enjoyable thought, like not like if something that facilitates those, not practical. I mean, ultimately, all the practical things we do are for the purpose of, like, paying your bills. You don't pay your bills as an end in itself. You pay your bills so that you keep the lights on, that you keep fresh water, but you don't just want fresh water and the lights on you want comfort, you want happiness, you want joy. And something like art, it doesn't comport with that sort of colloquial notion of practicality. It seems very impractical. It doesn't directly contribute to feeding you or sheltering you. A statue isn't going to prevent you from a flood, like killing you or destroying your house, but it has an immediate effect on making people happy. Like, notice the video itself has a bunch of art in it, and that makes consuming the video more enjoyable. There's an aesthetic element to it. And art, broadly construed, if we're talking aesthetics, it's just everywhere around us. The structure of our houses, the design of my cup has artistic designs on it. So, art is everywhere, and it has an immediate and direct practical benefit on improving the welfare and the happiness of everybody all the time, like every day. I think actually the practical benefits of art are underappreciated.
But I think in the same vein, right, basically maybe the point I was trying to get at is that someone like me who objects to philosophy, it's not, my objection isn't going to come from this place of that it's not practical. It's more so that if I kind of interrogate your values or something, I'll find that there's stuff that you care about, and that stuff is better served by doing something else with your time, right? Like if you care about true things, well, then there are better methods for answering questions well, or getting clarity on questions. If you care about doing social good, well, then you can do this instead of instead of kind of trying to be a part of some intelligentsia that influences cultural thought in some way or something. And so that I think that it's practical for particular ends, and then we'd have to kind of fix or set those ends before there'd be any room for disagreement almost.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, so I agree with that. So if we want to say practical, like practical in some nebulous, without specifying a goal, seems almost meaningless to me. Once we start asking, is philosophy useful for insert goal? Is it useful for giving us happiness? Is it useful for solving real world practical problems related to engineering or medicine? Is it useful for helping us structure and think about our lives in a systematic way where we make better practical decisions? There's all sorts of ways you could sort of flesh out, is it useful for X? And then ask whether it's useful for that. And then you could also ask the question, for all of these goals, how many people share these goals and how important do they consider those goals? And then you could ask the question, is there a cluster of important, widely shared goals for which philosophy is more useful than some other approach to addressing that goal or question? And I think the answer will turn out to be, in most cases, no. I think that there will be something else that's probably more useful. And that's important to recognize, because philosophers, and this is probably something we'll get to, they'll say philosophy can improve critical thinking. Okay, but like the current way it's taught, like is reading a bunch of Hume and Plato and Kant specifically really good for teaching you critical thinking? Let's say it improves critical thinking by like I don't know, let's say everybody starts with like 0 skill in critical thinking, and people that take an undergrad philosophy degree, they skill up by like 6 points in critical thinking by reading Hume and Kant or whatever. Okay, what if you gave some psychologists and economists, behavioral economists, and some other people, like they're like, you say, look, you got 1 year, come up with a critical thinking program to replace philosophy. And then they do it, and then it shows it improves it by 20 or 30 points. Is philosophy good for critical thinking? Well, good compared to what? It's not good compared to the behavioral economist system that no one has bothered to make. And part of that could be that philosophy is occupying a certain sort of academic niche. It's taking up the place of alternative methods and approaches that could be better. Now, what I think philosophers' rejoinder would be is, well, any economist or psychologist or whatever that devises a good critical thinking program would just be doing philosophy. So, we get to claim that. And I think there's a kind of Mott and Bailey here. Philosophers will want to, like, basically as a matter of topic, like critical thinking or thinking systematically or carefully considering cases. They want to say it's all philosophy. We own all that shit. So if you do it in the sciences, you're doing philosophy. If you do it somewhere else, you're doing philosophy. And we own that. So if it's good, then we get to say philosophy is good. But that's distinct from philosophy as it's taught, philosophy as it's practiced. Is that useful for the things that you're talking about? Is reading Hume good at teaching, or Kant, let's say reading a bunch of shit from Kant, is that going to make you good at critical thinking relative to some alternative? I think the answer is probably not. But the whole thing of saying we own everything that's in our topic matter, as if that means that, and here's what the trick is. If they could say that the economists and psychologists doing a critical thinking course, if it turned out to be really effective and it gave people 20 points in critical thinking, that's philosophy, therefore philosophy is useful. That's distinct from whether what they're currently doing is useful. But I think that when you say what you're currently teaching, like is pursuing a bachelor's degree in philosophy, is that going to yield the benefits? And then they say, well, hypothetically, some other people could do it some other way, and that would be beneficial. What? Okay, so therefore what you're currently doing is beneficial? That doesn't make any sense. It's like a bunch of a bunch of people that are doing like homeopathic doctors saying, yeah, homeopathy is really useful. And then you say, no, it's not useful. And they're like, oh, so you're saying medicine isn't useful? And you're like, no, you could do medicine scientifically, figure out how to actually treat diseases and then treat them. And then say, okay, but then you'd be doing medicine. So you're saying medicine is useful. Yeah, it's not homeopathic medicine. So maybe we should call much of contemporary philosophical practice like homeopathic philosophy, and then just make clear, I think homeopathic philosophy has no efficacy. If you want to tell me there's a useful philosophy, fine, but it's not the homeopathic philosophy.
Philosophy isn't practically useful. In my view, it's intrinsically valuable. Exploring the fundamental nature of reality with care, caution, rigor, and a love for truth just strikes me as deeply valuable in...
I'm sorry to pause, but just... And I'm sorry to Joe as well for not letting you speak 5 seconds, but it's just that it's that intrinsically and just strikes me as, which is like, okay, like fair enough for you, right? But you're gonna get, that's just like your opinion, dude. You know, like like it can be. I'm not gonna sort of gaslight you out of your feelings or something. You can value what you want to value, unless I think it's really, really harmful. Maybe I'll try and change your mind. But come on, like, are you trying to convince me or yourself? Like, why is it it just strikes me as really, oh, okay, great. Like, what am I going to do with that?
Yeah. So let's take it back, because I don't think I caught that part.
The ingenuity, insight, and experience. Likewise, even if philosophy isn't practically useful, in my view, it's intrinsically valuable. Exploring the fundamental nature of reality with care, caution, rigor, and a love for truth just strikes me as deeply valuable in and of itself.
Yeah, see, that's where I'm going to have some concerns. It's valuable in itself. I don't know what that means. Like, I can only understand something being valuable to me or for some goal or for some purpose. And I don't know what it would mean to say philosophy is intrinsically valuable.
Well, for me, the way that kind of discourse operates is it's stirring the passions, it's thumping the table, it's saying, no, really, it is, but I agree. But imagine what you've got to imagine is that someone doesn't share your views, right? And then is saying that gonna act as something that will persuade them. And I'm not sure it will. It's not kind of like a good neutral reason for someone to think that philosophy is valuable. Try and imagine if we disagree about any other topic. I'm a theist and you're an atheist or something, and you're trying to say, look, you should be an atheist because atheism is just really intrinsically valuable. Well, I'm like, well, I don't think that. I'm a theist. Like, I think that what's valuable is very different to you. Like, it's just not. It's not a very good thing to offer, right? As like a reason or something like that.
Well, I think it's not a good reason for precisely some of the same sorts of concerns I have with realist conceptions of value more generally. If I'm trying to consider whether I think this thing is useful, and you tell me it's just intrinsically useful, okay, well, I don't know what to do with that. Now, if a philosopher says,
well, you just go, oh, yeah. You're meant to go, yes, you're right. That's the only option, right?
So, like, if instead someone says, well, look, even if it has no practical benefits, I really enjoy doing it for myself. That I can make sense of. But in that case, I would just say, yeah, that's not a huge thing in favor of something. So, like, if someone was psychologically constituted where they loved watching paint dry or counting blades of grass, and they said, look, I find counting blades of grass intrinsically useful, or they could say, I find it non-instrumentally valuable to me. Okay, go ahead and count blades of grass, but that doesn't mean I need to like endorse it or support it or throw taxpayer dollars at it, that we need to have like programs where we issue degrees to students and we hand out loans to people to take courses in this, that we need to... Blades of grass is a much better thinker than anybody that doesn't. Like, there's so much built on top of philosophy that the fact that someone liked doing it is not a very good reason for the rest of society to build the structures in place to support it in ways that aren't sort of like self-funded. Like, we don't bend over backwards, at least not to my knowledge, to like super duper duper support a really esoteric practice that nobody else likes doing.
Like astrology.
Well, that could be one, but like, I don't think we sink a ton of stuff into like people playing chess.
Oh,
And to the
Outright,
extent
yeah.
that we did, it would be because people want to watch them play it, because a lot of people like doing it, like playing chess. You know, there's like sports and stuff like that. Now, if people really enjoyed watching philosophy debates, like if they, like the equivalent of what we were discussing now earned us like millions of dollars, like we were like, you know, super athletes, fair enough. Like then you're adding something to society, but I don't see too many people enjoying what philosophers do. Okay, let's keep going.
Whether or not it accrues practical benefits. But because this may not be convincing for those with a more practically oriented mindset, and because it really is true that philosophy has lots of practical payoffs, I'm going to set aside the point about intrinsic value and focus on philosophy's utility in today's video. So then, here's why philosophy isn't useless. Oh, and I'm drawing here from a video I made on common internet mistakes in philosophy and religion. All right, mistake number 54, philosophy is useless. So first up, suppose that that's true. It's not, as I'm about to explain, but suppose that that's true. So what, right? If you want to draw any normative or epistemological conclusion from that, such as that we should therefore stop doing it, or stop teaching it, or that it cannot produce any knowledge, well then congratulations, right? You're doing philosophy. If, for instance, you think philosophy cannot produce any knowledge, then your philosophical reasoning here cannot produce any knowledge, and your argument subverts itself. But in any case, it isn't true that philosophy is useless, and only those uninformed about its goings-on would make such a statement. There are, for starters, lots of personal intellectual benefits that philosophy cultivates. Critical writing and reading, parsing difficult texts, formulating and assessing the reasoning contained in arguments, seeing whether people's conclusions actually follow from the premises, pinpointing underlying or implicit assumptions, making distinctions that clarify and precisify debates, and so on down the list. All of this.
I think you're muted, Lance.
Yeah, I saw. Thoughts on that?
So, yeah, I mean, I don't like the way that these like self-defeating arguments get phrased, especially in not in all cases, but I think in like this one against philosophy is kind of bad, because the claim that philosophy is useless is usually not it's usually more complicated than like saying that there's this one thing called philosophy that has this property that is being useless, and now I'm doing it, and so I found a use for it, and so I've refuted myself. Instead, the claim that philosophy is useless is going to be something like, you know, there's a body of discourses, some of them are more beneficial than others of them. Some of them should be left behind and forgotten. Some of the things should be refined. Maybe we should reform the way that we think of it as an academic subject. Maybe there shouldn't be strict departments in this way, or there should. It's not really the strongest version of the claim isn't open to this like obvious self-defeat sort of argument, right? So that's one thing that I wanted to say. And then the second thing is about, again, all of the skills that it's saying that it helps with. I think that those are empirical claims that we either want to look at data for our conclusion there, or compare it to the way that other things support things. And then, for example, is scoring really highly on things like the LSAT or the GRE that important, considering that lots of institutions have found that there isn't that much of a correlation between the way that people score on these things and then their performance in academic programs, and so they've actually taken them off. I mean, like it's kind of like saying, you know, it will help you get into Mensa or something. It's like, oh great, but what's the benefits of like being a Mensa? Like again, it's going to just depend on what you want. Like, do you want to go into thousands of pounds of debt to have a really high GRE score or something, possibly? Like supposing that studying philosophy would improve your GRE score, because it's not clear whether or not, you know, whether the high GRE scores are caused by studying philosophy, if that's the claim here, or if it just means that people who go on to study philosophy happen to have high GRE scores. Like, again, there's just a lot going on, and there's not a very, it seems like this is a little bit of throwing shit at the wall, seeing what sticks kind of thing. Like, here's a bunch of things that sound good, and let's just associate them with philosophy, right? And I think you have to be a bit more careful than that.
Yeah, so regarding the self-defeat stuff, I don't find that very compelling, because, you know, there are some people that might be saying any and all systematic philosophical thinking, like anything, useless to do. And those people, if they're saying that, I think that they're wrong. Anybody that thinks like systematic and careful thought is useless, that's silly. If someone says all logic is useless and has no practical application, that's silly. If someone says developing the skills to critically construct, deconstruct, analyze, and evaluate arguments in a systematic way, that's useless, that's ridiculous. Of course that's useful. So all of those skills are useful. And anybody objecting to that, objecting to philosophy as a whole, I would disagree with them. But my concern is with homeopathic philosophy. It's with philosophy, it's with certain aspects of philosophy in practice. And so, again, you have that problem of philosophy broadly construed encompasses, like, if it's any systematic thinking, then of course it'd be ridiculous to say I systematically think that all systematic thinking is stupid and pointless. Okay, well, you're engaged in systematic thinking, so you're wrong. But, a lot of the people that I think want to articulate concerns with philosophy are, concerned with, hey, it's too focused on history. It's too focused on the views of specific individuals for no particularly good reason. It's too stuck. A lot of the ways of thinking are based on underdeveloped pre-scientific, or at least not very well up to date on the science, ways of thinking about language and meaning and cognition and belief formation. And it relies on a bunch of unnecessary jargon and terminology, psychologically questionable things like intuitions. I have an intuition. A person could just trot out concern after concern after concern with how philosophy is actually practiced. And those concerns, they might say philosophy, like a prioristic or rationalistic philosophy, is a bad way of doing philosophy. It does not furnish us with the right kind of knowledge. So there's all sorts of criticisms they could level at certain aspects, elements, approaches, or things going on within philosophy. And I think philosophy is sufficiently broad that someone could say, but look, there's good stuff over here, as if that covers for, excuses, or justifies the crappy things that are going on. So let's say, for instance, I tend to take a very empiricist approach to philosophy. I think empiricist approaches to philosophy are fantastic. And I like a lot of the more pragmatist approaches. So I'm going to like work from Dennett. I'm going to like work from Quine. I'm going to like work from Stitch. I'm going to like work from people who's from William James, from F.C.S. Schiller, particular sorts of philosophers. I love their work. I don't like all of it. I'm going to disagree with them on some things, but I think a lot of what they do is valuable. But the mere fact that some of them do stuff in a way using methods or presuppositions or approaches that I like doesn't mean that the rest of it is good. And you could say, but you need the whole field in order to get the good stuff. I'm not sure that that's true. It may be that because if we train everybody in medicine, some people become good doctors, some people aren't, but they're getting the same training. So if some of them end up being bad doctors, it doesn't mean medicine as practiced is bad. It just means some people are bad doctors. That's not the case with philosophy. It's not like everybody receives or carries on board the same assumptions and methods and approaches. There are different approaches, sort of endemic and built into the field. And I think some of those approaches are bad. So I think that's a problem. To try to say, if you're criticizing philosophy, you're doing philosophy, as if it's self-defeating, because I think you have to be able to make targeted criticisms without your own position being subject to those criticisms. Regarding the other claims, so we have this, philosophy cultivates critical thinking skills. Okay, how well does it cultivate critical thinking skills, and what's the evidence for that, and compared to what? So that's going to be a question for me. Showing that it could be that reading history cultivates some degree of critical thinking skills. Would that mean, if you wanted to teach people critical thinking skills, that you would give them a bunch of history books? That depends. Compared to what? What else could they be doing with that time? So it's a question of opportunity costs. What could we be doing other than studying philosophy and teaching philosophy the way that it's studied and taught that might benefit critical thinking skills in particular, better or worse? So I think we need a comparative evaluation. So we need empirical evidence, not only of how well philosophy does these things, but how well other disciplines do them, and like pilot programs for ways of teaching and thinking that fall outside the scope of any existing discipline. What would my version of teaching philosophy look like? Would that improve critical thinking skills better, worse? Might be worse, might be better. It's an empirical question. And the same applies to all of these. Better abilities to detect bullshit. How good is it at helping you detect bullshit? One of my concerns with philosophy is I think it inducts people into thinking in ways that I think are often bullshit. So, another concern I have with this is that it focuses on all the positive aspects as if the only thing philosophy might do is furnish us with all these benefits, but I don't see any discussion make you It might narrow your thinking, make you idiosyncratic, stuff you were saying earlier, make you have mistaken views about language and meaning, make you overly concerned with metaphysical considerations or overly pedantic or nitpicky on certain points that it's not helpful to think in those terms. So there might be ways in which philosophy, like studying philosophy and learning philosophy, impairs our critical reasoning skills in certain respects. And I don't know that anybody's seriously discussing or thinking about that. So
Oh, your mic cut out for that last little bit of what you said, by the way.
do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that there at least seem now. I don't have enough evidence to make like a strong claim here, but I have anecdotal evidence of the people I know that are interested in philosophy that actually the way that they've been trained to think about things philosophically can impede or get in the way of the way that they'll approach first order problems in like other disciplines like the sciences or politics or something, right? Because they get really focused on things like the conceptual analysis of terms involved and stuff like that, and then that gets in the way of doing the first order discipline that they're trying to do after philosophy. Now, I'd need a lot more data to like say whether or not that was something that was like systematic to people studying philosophy or something. But I agree that there are definitely questions about the ways that it might actually do harm as well. I was also just rereading that sentence of the all of this translates nicely into practical benefits, such as scoring very well on the LSAT, GRE, and things like that. So it does seem like the claim there is that studying philosophy causes you to score higher on the GRE. But I think that actually the claim Joe wanted to make there is that the GRE scores of people applying to graduate programs for philosophy are higher than those in a lot of other subjects, right? Which is true or has been true historically. Even I guess I've taken it out in a lot of places now, but that doesn't explain why those scores are high in the first place. Like, is it the studying of philosophy, or is it, is the reason that people are applying for these programs because they're the group of people who have high GRE scores or something? Like, what you're not doing there is accounting for the ways that studying philosophy actually changes, or the way that GRE scores vary as a result of someone studying philosophy, right?
Yeah, I agree. Let's play that part, and then I'll make a brief comment on that, because I think you've pretty much said what I would want to say here.
This translates nicely into various practical benefits, such as scoring very well on the LSAT, GRE, and things like that. In fact, philosophy majors perform substantially better than average for each of these standard tests for admission to graduate school, and not a single other group of majors shows such consistent high level of achievement. This indicates a high level of general skills sought after by employers too, right? The ability to think rigorously, express oneself clearly, analyze situations and arguments, and come up with creative solutions to problems, and being...
Okay, so my main concern with this is simply that this data primarily shows correlations. So people that study philosophy tend to do well on these standardized tests. And as you put out, the question is like, why? What's actually driving that? It could just be that people who already performed well in these sorts of tests choose to study philosophy. And so a big factor here could just be selection effects. People that do well in these tests study philosophy, not that studying philosophy causes you to do well on these sorts of tests. So, there's also more general skepticism about the degree to which an undergraduate education confers measurable benefits in the first place. I don't know how well this is held up to scrutiny, but you have stuff like Kaplan's book, The Case Against Education, which argues that a great deal of the benefits associated with studying in college don't appear to be attributable directly to what is acquired via one's education. I think it's an open question. If you look, you'll see older papers mostly arguing that philosophers will claim that it improves critical thinking skills, but there's actually very little evidence to show that this is the case. I am sympathetic to that, but I recently saw, and I saw it, I think I downloaded it and I shoved it in a folder somewhere and didn't get around to reading it. A paper arguing that there is some causal evidence for benefits of studying philosophy, but I just haven't had time to evaluate that. And so it is an open empirical question. It could turn out, and it could be that we already have good evidence that philosophy yields some sort of like studying philosophy causally increases people's abilities across a range of dimensions. But I very much doubt even a single paper could decisively establish that. And if that exists against a backdrop of a bunch of research which raises questions about that, it might be that the overall literature just really doesn't support those claims. I don't know enough to say one way or the other because it's just not a literature I've dove into. But the bottom line here is that what we have is correlational data for the most part. This has not shown that studying philosophy causes people to get much better at these things. And I very much doubt that there's really solid evidence for that.
Yeah, and I think another further thing is, this claim that these are general skills that are sought after by employees. It kind of sounds plausible on the face of it, but I think that, again, what is being sought to be established there, you'd really want to look at the employment rates, for example, of people who are graduating from philosophy programs, and then outcomes for people who graduated from philosophy programs in their careers. So how does their performance differ against peers? Is philosophy conferring them with skills that are useful in the workplace, rather than this sort of just kind of like gesturing really at a notion that there are these skills that are being developed by philosophy, and second, that they're the right sort of skills for the jobs that people get afterwards.
Yeah, so Kaplan makes a point that if you look at like employment and income and that sort of thing, if you look at someone that did their 4-year degree and completed the degree, and you compare the income and success for those people to people that did like 3.5 years, almost finished, and then dropped out at the last minute, it's a big difference. And if it was simply that they were obtaining some type of knowledge, skills, and ability that were being appreciated and recognized in the workplace, you would expect that difference to be fairly small. Whereas if you're saying, hey, much of the difference in what employers are looking for is the sort of official stamp showing, look at me, I'm the kind of person that could stick it out for 4 years and earn a degree, that is better explained by the degree of difference between those two situations. And I suspect that this would apply to a great deal to philosophy as well, that a lot of this is going to be basically getting a degree in philosophy signals something about you, but it's unclear that the philosophy education you receive as an undergraduate is actually causing you to have acquired special skills, competencies, and abilities in virtue of studying philosophy. I think it's a lot harder to show that. And so I wouldn't say it couldn't turn out that that's true, but I think philosophers, are a little too quick to look at correlational data and make, I think, premature claims about the what's really going on here.
Being able to map out those solutions and the pros and cons. Philosophy also helps us better inform our moral and political views, which in turn helps us live better lives. For instance, by helping us decipher whether it's moral or immoral to eat meat, to refrain from donating most of our income to charity, to lock people up in prison, to have an abortion, to uphold a system of private ownership of the means of production, and so on down the list. Philosophy.
I'd pause on that point as well. I just, again, don't think that that's true. I would need to see, well, I guess firstly, what I'm doing to evaluate that, right, is I'm thinking basically about what my views are. And again, they're the very things that's contested in the first place. And then I'm thinking, how does studying philosophy incline people to sort of agree morally with me, basically, is the way I'm making that assessment. Now, you can question that. Obviously, that's like a highly subjective. But when I actually look at people that I know that study philosophy, it seems that a lot of them actually move towards either like weird theocratic views, because they're like because I'm in philosophy of religion circles, so I find people who basically become like the Catholic version of the Taliban in terms of the politics that they have, and they're really hard to argue out of it because they've had years and years and years to study all these bloody arguments that you have to engage with and untangle just to get into their cognitive process behind like why they have the political views that they have. And I wouldn't say that that's a good thing, right? That those people have done that. And I also know a lot of people who have become like either really strong edgelord like communist types or edgelord like fascists because they've read like these really niche like Nazi philosophers or something, right? And I don't know that these are exactly representative of the overall sample, but it doesn't seem to me that there's this general rule at play where people actually become better at thinking, become better citizens, they vote better on policies or anything like that as a result of studying philosophy. But I have seen lots of examples of the people who care about things like politics adopting weird, edgy, radical views and being really hard to argue out of them.
Yeah.
Philosophy as a discipline also has various benefits. And here we're going to listen to some portions of Graham Priest's talk on the nature of philosophy and its place in the university.
Okay, should we play this or skip it?
I'm happy to play it. It's up to you, really, how you want to do it.
I'm going to speed it up. I want to get through this because I don't want to stick around forever. I've got maybe another half hour in me.
Yeah, no problem.
There are two very important aspects of philosophy that Passmore's account throws into prominence. The first is that philosophy is essentially critical. This is the first point I'm going to flag. This is one of the things that distinguishes philosophy from religion, politics, and normal science, in the sense of Tom Cohn, the historian of science. Nothing is sacrosanct. Everything is fair game for challenge. Must defend.
Yeah, just a quick comment on that. I mean, might be a philosophical ideal, but I think it's not entirely true. So it may be that technically speaking, everything is up for challenge in philosophy. But look, part of the reason I'm having this discussion is because when you take a metaphilosophical view that's very critical of much of mainstream analytic philosophy, you get a kind of cold reception from a lot of people. And there are quite a people, you have people calling me a pretender and a liar. There are philosophers that won't speak with me when as far as I can tell, I mean, maybe I said something rude or nasty to them, but I don't think so. And I think that some people don't want to talk to me simply because of my views and the way I express them. I think that philosophy does have its dogmas. And I think this idea that it's open to challenging everything is just not true.
Yeah, and I think like one of those dogmas, right, is going to be first the idea that we're doing something very, very important by doing philosophy.
Yeah, the very question here, I think, look, I've said stuff critical about like certain aspects of philosophical methods. And I've had people say, then why are you studying philosophy? Why are you here? Why don't you go to a science department where you belong, basically?
I got told that in a lecture once, actually, when I was questioning. I was like, it was like, well, what are you doing here then? I was like, well, like I've paid my money now and I'm in.
Yeah, so there's a certain degree of social pressure to view, among other things, philosophy's armchair insistence as a noble and good thing. And I think there's also a discomfort with questioning the intelligibility of what philosophers are saying. So if I say, hey, that philosopher's view is wrong, that's fine. But if I say that philosopher is literally talking complete nonsense, that's often seen as aggressive, inappropriate, rude, ridiculous. Even if you could make a case for it, which is kind of hard to do. But like, why is that not a legitimate position to take on something? I think the answer is it is. And I think philosophers they're not simply rejecting that on purely intellectual grounds. I think that they have a discomfort with philosophical positions that would have implications about the meaningfulness of what they're doing.
Bend itself or go under. The second aspect that Passmore's account throws into prominence is that philosophy has a symbiotic relationship with other disciplines. It draws many of its central issues from other areas, such as physics, psychology, law, literature, and so on. And in return, it provides for them a critique of their methods, patterns of argument, and fundamental beliefs, which spur on the
Yeah, so this idea that it's critiquing other fields, I don't know how much that actually does anything in practice.
So the one thing is, like, I wouldn't dispute the fact that philosophers are talking about things that other people are doing, right? But then that comes back to the kind of criticism that I had earlier, where I was saying, to what degree are things happening, and then philosophers just kind of talk about them and try and make it about themselves, sort of thing. Now, I do think that there is some room for what I would consider, allopathic philosophy rather than homeopathic philosophy or whatever, which would be where there's some room maybe to help make methodology better or to clarify ambiguous new terms and things like that, or terms that might be being used in a weird way in a field. But yeah, to what degree philosophy actually does that, I'm not too sure, to be honest. I mean, there's a great example as well of wasn't there a Canadian politician who'd been a political philosophy lecturer at Harvard for like 30 years or something, and then he ran, and then afterwards he was like, yeah, the reality of doing politics is so different from like all of the political philosophy theory, couldn't make it work. I don't know, that's not a great example just to point to, but
yeah, I don't know anything about that particular case. What I can tell you is that we could probably find cases where philosophers contribute to these fields. And speaking for myself, I have critiques of these scales used in psychological research that is trying to measure how people think about meta-ethics, how people think about free will. And I use my philosophical knowledge of these concepts and, careful thinking about ambiguity to like literally critique like a psychological scale. So I'm not just saying, hey, it looks like these results are p-hacked, or hey, there's this problem with the like the factor structure. I can comment on that stuff, but I will just straight up look at a question and say, I don't think this is a good operationalization of a philosophical concept. And that would be hard to know if you don't have the philosophical background. And so in those cases, I can directly contribute, drawing on philosophical knowledge, to the actual design, implementation, and construction of a psychological measure. I've had a hell of a time getting this kind of work published. There aren't a lot of journals that are interested. My experience with this is I send this stuff off to a philosophy journal and they'll say, this looks like too much psychology for us. Consider a psychology journal. I go send it to a psych journal and they're like, yeah, we don't publish philosophy. What are you doing? So there are journals like Philosophical Psychology that will publish work at the intersection of the two, but it's not that. I mean, Cognition is another one. They do exist. But by and large, the interdisciplinary endeavors like this it's not typical for anyone to actually do this sort of work. And when they do, for that work to be readily picked up and sort of absorbed by the academic world as a standard thing people do. I think what I do is actually kind of unusual. I don't see too many philosophers critiquing psychological skills. So this is just talking about its application to psychology. I doubt it's particularly applicable to a lot of fields, at least in practice. So any further thoughts, or should I continue?
Yeah, continue.
Long-term development of those subjects. But despite these things, I think that Passmore's account is wrong. It takes account of what we might call the analytic side of philosophy, that is, its critical and evaluative aspects, but it ignores what we might call the synthetic side, because philosophy is also a strongly imaginative and creative subject, and this is the second point that I flag. Philosophers have produced some of the most ingenious and important theories in Western thought. Sometimes the theories become, deservedly or undeservedly, mere history. More importantly, sometimes the theories are taken up by later disciplines to provide bases for important developments. Thus, in science, atomism and positivism. Positivism played an important role in both the special theory of relativity and psychological behaviorism. Both these things, atomism and positivism, to name just a couple from a long list, were first thought of by philosophers. In politics, the ideas of Hobbes, Locke, and Marx have all been made the bases of political systems. In art, the Romantic movement of the 19th century owed much to the Romantic philosophy of Rousseau, Coleridge, and others. And so it goes on.
This seems to echo what you were saying earlier about the historical stuff. Is this what prompted those remarks?
It wasn't this in particular. It's actually a book by a historian on the Enlightenment that I started reading last year and never finished, that got me thinking in this way initially, because most of my introduction to the Enlightenment had been through what philosophers have to say about it, right? And then I was reading this book by a historian who was kind of saying, I mean, look, what I'm about to say is a kind of exaggerated version and probably not true to exactly his conclusions, but it was to the effect of, well, really, there are only three, outwardly atheist people across Europe, and they published like 2 books, and most of, just that the case is really overstated for the role that pure reasoned philosophical thought was playing. And then he pointed out how riots would happen in a certain area, or some political movement would happen, economic policy would change somewhere, and then a philosopher would write a book kind of about this new popular thing afterwards. And that was what got me thinking, I wonder. And then also, obviously, like, my undergrad's in software engineering, and I work as a software engineer, so I know a bit about computers and the history of computer science too. And that's another area where, again, philosophers say a bunch of rubbish about artificial intelligence, computers, the way they work, but also connections between the origins of computing and philosophical thought in logic and the development there too, where they really grasp to make these links between people like Frege and the first kind of like electronic computers being developed.
Yeah, fair enough. My guess is if we looked into how philosophers handle language, that it's just going to be wildly out of alignment with what would likely be the better accounts in like language cognition and that sort of thing too. All right, let's see if we can get through the rest of this.
Indeed, as Passmore himself said in a recent interview in the Bulletin, and I quote, almost all the ideas which we now take for granted came from philosophy. To understand the other illuminating but incorrect account of philosophy that I want to talk about, it is necessary to look at the historical development of Western thought. It's a striking fact that philosophy is the area out of which nearly all other more specialized intellectual inquiries that we now recognize sprang, and this is the third point that I flag. They each broke away from philosophy when they developed specialized methods appropriate to dealing with the objects of their inquiry. Mathematics was the first to break away in about the 3rd century BC. Pythagoras was as much philosopher as mathematician. Euclid was not. Astronomy broke away about the 2nd century AD with Ptolemy. Physics and the other natural sciences broke away in the early 17th century at the times of Galileo and Descartes. And sociology, psychology, economics, and so on broke away in the 19th century, and so it went. We're currently witnessing philosophy give birth to literary theory, and what subjects will follow is anyone's guess.
Yeah, just a quick point about this, which is that, even if philosophy can be credited with having given rise to these other fields, that doesn't mean philosophy in its present form is useful. Christians will sometimes say Christianity was responsible for the modern science. Okay, even if we granted that, that doesn't mean it's useful now. Like, is it going to give us anything else? One thing that you could say is, looking at the history of philosophy, is maybe it birthed all the important fields, and now what's left is the leftovers. So the people that are still fiddling around in philosophy are the people that don't have any important new fields to devise. I don't know if you have anything to add.
No. And then I would just say, again, it's probably going to be more complicated than simply just one or the other. But again, all the things that Graham's talking about, you can sort of look at as, well, yeah, a lot of what philosophers are doing is pulling this thread out of people thinking about things throughout history. But, is that thread the thing that's causing each of those things to happen? Or is it actually something that's being influenced by those things that are happening? How can you kind of decide between the two, right?
Yeah, it's hard to see how a contemporary armchair a prioristic rationalist approach to philosophy, like contemporary metaphysics, could birth any of this, like chemistry or biology or any sort of systematic around us, because it's so rarefied and so not in touch with the world around it. The kind of thing that you can do sitting around inside of a box just seems so removed from what all the sciences do, that the idea that thinking in a box is the source, it's not as if the modern armchair philosopher talking about meta-ethics gave rise to psychology, like that approach, that perspective, because psychology, including moral psychology, is very much predicated on directly engaging with and studying how people actually speak, think, and act. And when you have entire branch of approaches in meta-ethics where the philosopher maintains, I could figure out what people speak, what people mean or what they think by thinking about it or analyzing sentences without actually looking at any actual, they're not recording sentences, they're not interviewing people, they're making up sentences and analyzing those. I don't see how that approach could have given rise to psychology. It seems anti-psychological. It seems like, I don't need to do psychology. I can just do this. So how would that give rise to psychology? I think the answer is it wouldn't, and it didn't. And that the people that started doing psychology are the people like, hey, I want to understand morality or human behavior or why people have personalities, how much personalities vary or what social behaviors, whatever those questions. I'm going to go out and look. Right. And if anything, their model might have been physics and biology and chemistry. And then let's do systematic evaluation of the world around us. William James, I think, who got the ball rolling in psychology in the United States. And, William James was a philosopher, but William James is also a pragmatist and, very, extreme empiricist. That approach to philosophy is not popular among contemporary analytic philosophers. If you look at the 2020 Phil Paper survey, it's 1,785 people or something like that. And you look at how many do analytic philosophy, it's huge. It's most of them. And then you look at how many say that they're pragmatists, and I think it was 13 or something. It was some 0.1% or something absurd like that. Not a lot of people are calling themselves pragmatists on that survey. And so the approach is that a philosopher that gave rise to or not really gave rise, but there were other people that contributed to giving rise to contemporary psychology, was very much in the stream of approach to philosophy that I take, and very much misaligned with mainstream analytic philosophy.
Yeah. So to to maybe put some flesh on the bones of the way that I'm thinking, right, is, if you kind of name drop someone like Pythagoras, well, is the reason that he's of importance to us because he thought about these big questions related to metaphysics and theology, and then that caused him to have some successful theories with triangles? Or did he happen to have some successful theories about triangles, so we still talk about him today, and then when we talk about him today, we see that he was into like a bunch of other stuff, like you know, not eating legumes or whatever, weeing into the sun and all those sorts of things, and we go, oh yeah, cool, like clearly there's some philosophy going on here. The point is it the philosophy that's causing those things, or is it the other thing that is more useful to us, and then we just find out that this person happened to be into philosophy, sorry. And I don't think there's going to be it's going to just be one way or the other here, right? But I think that there's going to be it's going to be more complicated than just that philosophy in all these cases is just causing people to have like great practical ideas.
Yeah, I agree. So I do think it's what I'll say about this is it's possible philosophy plays a causal role in some of the good things in society, and that it has practical benefits. What I will say, though, is that philosophers aren't doing a particularly impressive job of demonstrating or making compelling cases that this is in fact the case in any given context. I think in a lot of cases they can draw some historical line or point to a correlation, and then I think that they're making causal conclusions that are not really justified. To the extent that philosophers do that, and I don't want to say that Joe is doing that in any particular case in this video, or that Graham Priest or anybody in particular is doing that. But what I will say is that I think that often is the case, and there's an irony when that does occur. Like you'll see philosophy departments saying, "Hey, philosophy, improves critical thinking skills," or something like that. And then if you say, well, why? And then they'll say, well, philosophy students have better critical thinking skills than people in another discipline. Oh, so you're inferring causation from a correlation without adequate data to show that it really follows? I mean, there's an irony in saying, hey, we're really good at critical thinking, and then that's based on a complete failure to engage in critical thinking and pointing to the data. There's something silly about that. All right, I'm going to continue the video.
It's interesting to note that logic, which could have broken away at any time after the 3rd century BC, has retained its central locus in philosophy, despite its forging alliances with other disciplines. The fact that philosophy has given birth to most other theoretical inquiries cannot provide the basis of a definition of philosophy. It's a fact that it itself cries out for explanation, presumably in terms of the nature of philosophy. So far, then, in the search for a definition of philosophy, we've drawn a blank. We've already seen enough, however, for me to take up the secondary theme of this lecture, the role of philosophy in university, to which I now turn. Universities have 3 prime functions and, correlatively, 3 prime responsibilities. And I shall argue that philosophy is important, indeed essential, to each of these. The first is research. The first function of a university is to research, and the correlative responsibility is to the subject researched. There's no older academic discipline than philosophy. This has always been a prime area of research in universities. Moreover, it's important to remember that universities now bear the sole responsibility for research in philosophy. Gone are the days when either church or private incomes provided for the livelihood of philosophers. If the universities of the world closed their philosophy departments, philosophy would cease. The fascination of the human mind for some of the most profound problems that can be posed will ever outstrip local institutional arrangements. However, organised research in philosophy would cease. For this reason, if no other, universities have a responsibility to ensure the existence of thriving philosophy departments. However, the importance of research in philosophy far outstrips its own local confines. As I pointed out, historically, philosophy has functioned as the mother of theoretical inquiries, giving birth to them all. If we wish new areas or disciplines to emerge, and there's no reason to smugly assume that all that there can be already are, research in philosophy is essential to provide the metrics out of which they may arise.
So maybe pause there,
Secondly,
right? So Graham's just made a claim that if we stopped having philosophy departments, then we wouldn't see new subjects emerge, right? And again, I'm just not sure that is true. I think even in modern history, we can see lots of examples of new fields of study being birthed out of the primary scientific disciplines, for example, right? Or even out of other humanities than philosophy, though I'm sure all of these philosophers would be happy to characterize as philosophy because, seemingly anything where people are thinking about questions can be characterized as philosophy. But yeah, I mean, I think some of what he was saying was reasonable, but that bit about if philosophy stopped entirely, well, for example, the case he was making about providing people with resources enables them to think about these questions better than they would otherwise. I think if he made the more modest case that I really like doing that, so I wish they wouldn't stop as something, he'd maybe have a stronger argument. But yeah, the idea that if universities were to stop altogether, you just wouldn't get these new disciplines being born out of, I don't think that that's right. And I think that that's, can be empirically demonstrated just by looking at the history of the past 100 years.
Yeah, it's also just that's speculation about a counterfactual. Like, if we got rid of them, or under conditions in which philosophy didn't exist, we wouldn't get new philosophy or new disciplines being born. So we need philosophy. Based on what? Like, I don't see a good historical, empirical basis for presuming that is or would be true were we to get rid of philosophy in the universities. So, like, basing this on a prognostication about the implications of what would happen under a counterfactual is that's really, really tentative, as saying, hey, philosophy is really important because if we didn't have it, bad things would happen. Okay, maybe. What I want to flag about these kinds of comments is that it's not like someone saying, hey, there were two regions of this nation, and this one region, we implemented this new medication and it reduced mortality rates by 70%. So that medication is useful. There's nothing like that that I'm aware of that's showing that philosophy is useful, like direct, really compelling evidence. Instead, it's someone saying, if we didn't not only have philosophy, but have it in our institutions, then we wouldn't get new disciplines. How would I know if that's true or not? Yeah.
And as I've already noted, research in special areas, once they have evolved, does not decouple itself from philosophy. Fundamental problems are thrown back to philosophy for analysis, and philosophers are in the ideal position to perform this service. First, because of their training in critical scrutiny. Secondly, because they're willing to question things which practitioners of the special areas are not themselves prepared to question at that time. And third, because they're prepared to suggest fruitful, speculative ideas.
Yeah, so I want to take this back for a couple seconds, because there's a bunch of stuff I think
to perform this service. First, because of their training in critical scrutiny. Second.
Yeah, so what I'm questioning is whether they're actually adequately trained in critical scrutiny relative to some alternative. So just saying, hey, philosophy is useful for this thing because philosophers are good at this other thing, when I'm skeptical that they've established that they're particularly good at that other thing, is already helping himself to a presumption that I'm not granting. So that's a concern.
Because they're willing to question things which practitioners of the special areas are not themselves prepared to question at that time.
Look at that one. So they're willing to question things that people that are practicing in those areas are not willing to question at that time. Are we going to say that, like, for instance, if philosophers questioning something in physics or scientists within those fields are not willing to question them at that time? Is that the claim? Am I understanding that right?
I think there's a few ways that you could understand that claim, right? And one of them would be maybe what Graham's saying is they're not equipped to answer those questions. Maybe what he's saying is they're not interested in asking those questions, like they have blind spots. I'm not 100% sure which he means.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but again, citation needed. So if philosophers want to say, hey, we're uniquely well positioned to question dogmas in particular fields that the people within those fields are unprepared or unwilling to ask, show the evidence that that's actually true. And I'm not going to be overwhelmed or super impressed by case studies and a few historical anecdotes that are really piecemeal.
Yeah, this is one of the things, right, where I do think that philosophy can. Oh, sorry. Where I think philosophy.
No, I clicked it by accident.
Yeah, is that where philosophy can potentially do something that those fields aren't, just maybe because funding in those fields is going on certain things, and so maybe philosophy can have like this different perspective. But I always caveat that with the thought that, well, this is just one potential way of structuring things in the academy, right? There's no reason why you couldn't, within that discipline, fund some set of research programs into these methodological questions, and I'm certain that there'd be people who are interested in them within those disciplines as well. So yeah, I think that claim is it's not this like absolute kind of defense of philosophy or something.
Yeah, I can imagine a structure like within any of the special sciences, you just have theoretical biology. And then you just have, 10% of the biologists are theoretical biologists, and their job is to critically scrutinize what other biologists do. Now, maybe that's an awkward fit. It wouldn't work well, but I think that there's this perpetual failure to distinguish between philosophy as it has been institutionalized and as it's practiced, and philosophy in principle, or what role society could, like, if philosophy departments tomorrow all close down, do we think that nobody would be willing and able to critically scrutinize stuff in physics or biology? I think if those, among other things, we might expect that if those things are really valuable, they would emerge of their own accord. A lot of what this sounds like is, hey, we need to keep the lights on in our philosophy departments, not we need philosophy, which are two different things. It would be one thing if someone said, hey, it's really important to understand physics or chemistry. We need to study chemistry because chemistry is valuable. And someone saying, hey, chemistry as a discipline is really important. We need to keep the chemistry department open. It needs funding and money, and we need to support it. Those are two separate things. If chemists were doing a really bad job, it'd be weird for them to say, well, we need chemistry chemistry as an institution, rather than saying, no, we just need good chemistry. If chemistry as an institution is bad, fix it or start a new one. But again, I think that philosophers are, again, there's an irony here too. It's philosophers themselves that are failing to disambiguate philosophy in principle and philosophy in practice. And these ironies to me are telling, because philosophers are sitting here touting the merits of their discipline in a way that to me illustrates an ironic failure to exemplify the ideals that the discipline, the skill set that discipline is supposed to instill in them, and the ideals that they're supposed to live up to. Seems like a problem to me. Right, I'll continue unless, okay, just stop me if you need to.
Yeah.
Secondly, because they're willing to question things which practitioners of the special areas are not themselves prepared to question at that time. And third, because they're prepared to suggest fruitful, speculative ideas that someone deeply ingrained in the subject is unlikely to countenance.
Yeah, again, citation needed. How do they know people deeply ingrained in the field can't come up with good speculative ideas?
Historian of science, Tom Kuhn, I've already mentioned, in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, observed that philosophy has played an important role in all revolutions in the natural sciences. His point would have been equally valid for revolutions in psychology, politics, or whatnot. The second function of a university is to teach, and the correlative responsibility is to its students. In one respect, this is but a corollary of the previous function. You can't have research in a subject unless you train researchers. However, few people who are undergraduates at this university or any other will become researchers. What then are they doing here? Part of the answer is that they're here to absorb a body of information, which they'll go then out into the wider world and apply. But this is only a part of the story, however, and a smaller part than many would think. If this were all there were to teaching, there would be a much more cost-effective way of going about it. We could just create Battery Hen University. The rest of the story is that universities should produce thoughtful, mature, rational, well-rounded people who are capable of living their lives to the full and enriching those of others. If someone can leave a university without having had the opportunity to think about the existence of God, various moral problems, such as abortion, the rights and wrongs of the political system in which they live, the nature of the physical universe in which they live, in short, in philosophy, then that university has failed its students. In an ideal world, all students would perhaps take courses which require them to think about these issues. However, this is not an ideal world, as I need hardly remind you. Time is a scarce commodity, but even in a less than ideal world, students may attend open discussions, seminars, debates on these issues, provided only that they are available. And they should be available in any university worth its salt. There was a debate in the correspondence columns of The Australian about 6 months ago on whether the new universities being renamed in Australia are real universities. And the centre of the debate seemed to have become whether or not they could be real universities without any philosophical presence. And there was a letter from one of the heads of these institutions, whom I now forget, who pointed out that real universities didn't need to have a philosophical presence because there were some quite bona fide universities which didn't have a philosophical presence. For example, there was the University of Padua in the 12th century. Point made. Thus, philosophy should play an integral role in both the formal and the informal educational life of a university. The third function of a university is to be the locus of certain social resources, and the correlative responsibility is to society. In a sense, this too is a corollary of the previous point. As I said then, it is a function of a university to produce people who can enrich the lives of others, and doing so is precisely fulfilling one's responsibilities to society. This is done in many ways, and I attempt no exhaustive list. But first, people at universities are able to help others appreciate their cultural heritage, be this philosophy, literature, or science. Secondly, they can actually create this cultural heritage. Amongst the humanities, philosophy is quite unique in this respect. Writers are rarely to be found in English departments.
This point for a second.
Few people in music departments are composers. But with few exceptions, creative philosophers are found in and only in...
Lads,
Whoops.
oh, there we go. Yeah.
Yep.
Don't worry.
Yeah, it was in
Yeah,
the
I just
wrong
want.
window.
I just want to say I don't necessarily disagree with what Graham's saying here in terms of like the role of the university and what it does. Now, I don't know exactly if philosophy is best positioned still to achieve those goals. You know, maybe actually you're better to have people doing those first order subjects rather than philosophers of subject, you know, in order to do that, be that literature or history or whatever, right? But I don't disagree with the point of, you know, universities should be producing people who can help them appreciate, you know, history and their culture and things like that. So yeah.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add here. I think we might be wrapping up on the end of it, so that's good. Should I continue?
Yeah, sounds good.
In university philosophy departments. Next, people at universities have an important role to play in social commentary and criticism, be this through the media, government commissions, moves for social and legal reform, and so on. Now, philosophers have an important role to play in these things, but usually they've thought about the issues professionally, and just as importantly, have no special interests to protect.
Okay. Philosophers
Yeah.
have no special interest to protect? Come
Yeah.
on. I don't buy that at all. And also, like, they have an important role to play here. How often do you see philosophers playing a role in like major public political discussions and public policy? I think the answer is almost never. Philosophers might think, hey, we would be like, I think a lot of philosophers aspire to be these philosopher kings and philosopher queens that have some critical role to play in society. And the bottom line is they just don't play the roles that they think they do or that they aspire to. This is not a thing. Philosophers are not contributing to these things.
I agree. Like typically, philosophers deeply want to be in the subject that they're philosophizing about, but aren't. They're kind of on the outside of it.
One has to think that if, well, you don't have to think. It's a figure of speech. I'm inclined to think that if philosophers consistently and reliably had valuable contributions over the past few decades, that their input in a lot of these areas would be more welcome. And you have the kind of reverse kind of effect. The fact that they're not typically very well received, I think, could be taken as some degree of evidence that maybe what they're offering isn't particularly valuable. I don't know.
Moreover, they're good social critics for exactly the same reasons that they're good critics in general. They have both highly developed critical skills and are prepared to float novel ideas. Of course, this may make them unpopular sometimes. I've yet to see a government that welcomed criticism, which is why the independence of the universities from outside power groups, most notably the government, is absolutely crucial to fulfilling this social role.
Okay, getting back to our script, it's well known that philosophy has given birth to lots of other fields once we reached consensus on the relevant methods for investigating the relevant domain. Significant parts of what we now call science was once natural philosophy, economics, psychology, computer science, and boatloads of other fields branched off from philosophy relatively recently, in fact. For instance, the theoretical basis for computing was worked out by logicians, such as Gödel and Church, before the first electronic computer was even thought of. There's also tons of interdisciplinary work happening right now between philosophers, scientists, engineers, and many others as regards AI. Between philosophers...
I should just say very quickly, I do interdisciplinary research to the extent that philosophy serves as a kind of facilitator of interdisciplinary research. I'm all for it. This is the kind of philosophy I think is good philosophy.
But I still would want to say I think that this is a little bit anachronistic. No, I'm not. You know, the pure kind of logic that Gödel and Church were involved in. Okay, I think you're probably better off considering it a branch of mathematics. So, for example, if you look at the type of mathematics that's typically done. Sorry, the type of logic that's typically done as part of a mathematics undergraduate course, you compare that to the type of logic that's typically done in, say, a philosophy undergraduate course, you'll find that the mathematicians probably do touch on some of these things and they probably understand them quite well, whereas the philosophers will not really get close to understanding a lot of these proofs and theorems in their own terms. And that's just because within mathematics, there's a lot more rigor. There's a lot more kind of like depth, and that's because these papers rightly belong to that field, I think, rather than to philosophy. And similarly, when we look at like the engineering problems and things like that, it very quickly it's almost only tangentially that a lot of these things touch on philosophy, really, you know. When we're talking about the origins of computing, and then when it comes to these conversations about AI and stuff like that as well, again, I think it's pretty much purely an engineering problem, except for maybe when you consider the ethics. But again, I think a lot of the like AI and ethics thing is like a scam to secure funding, basically, and actually very useless to the actual field or what anyone in the corporate world or political world is doing about or with AI, right? And I think that some of that falls foul of some of the criticisms that we are sort of levying against philosophy generally, where there's this process of constructing a legitimate discourse about ethics in AI or something, and then it just has very little to do with what's actually going on in AI research or in the corporate world or anything like that.
Yeah, I don't know enough about that specific topic. I feel like, training in ethics would allow me to say some useful and insightful things to people working in certain scientific areas that might not occur to them, but I don't know. So, but I also, I'm speaking about how I would approach things and not necessarily how the field as a whole approaches these sorts of things. I don't know. I don't know enough about applied aspects of ethics and how valuable it might be and how it could contribute to certain sorts of areas. I think that, again, it's an empirical question. It's a tough question to answer. I would be interested in seeing what people working in those fields have to say. So what do people in medicine and law and in these other sorts of fields say about the value of philosophy? The other thing I would say is, let's just say that they say, yeah, it's not very useful. I wouldn't take that to be, decisive evidence that it's not useful, because it could be that it's influencing things in ways that they don't appreciate or realize. So I just think a lot of these questions are tough, and I think philosophers are being a little quick in saying that it's super valuable. Right.
Yeah, so something I've seen, and it would need more survey data to flesh this out, but I've seen a lot of the people who work on so like LLMs, the type of AI that's been really popular this past year, tend to basically be more like verbal behaviorists, in my experience. That's not backed by any data other than people I've talked to. And then people coming from more of a philosophy perspective tend to be more Philip Goff or Bernardo Kastrup type philosophers of mind who are saying, yeah, but it doesn't have, like special soul source, and that's the problem. And I think that characterizes the two very, very different ways of thinking about philosophy and the problems and stuff. What one group views them essentially as these engineering problems to be solved, and will accept however ordinary people use words like sentient or person or whatever when they feel it's appropriate to for the kind of things that they build. And the other group sort of thinks they have a conceptual analysis of those things a priori and so forth, and then they just have to apply it to the right cases, of which they don't think certain machines are the right cases for the application of those words.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah, so this is another case where I would say that I wouldn't want to say that philosophy can't contribute to these areas. What would concern me is that, like, can philosophy contribute to psychology? I think so, because I think that I do it, and I think I'm contributing. And I think this plausibly would be true of AI. There could be people with training in philosophy that do work in this area. I know people that do philosophy of science, philosophy of computer science, and that sort of thing. And the work they do looks really valuable and useful and thoughtful to me. But they're very much more in a camp and approach to philosophy similar to my approach, not in every respect. But then there's going to be these other approaches to philosophy that I think not only may not contribute meaningfully and helpfully to these fields, but might actually muddy the waters in a way that actually hinders things worse. So
yeah,
what troubles me is if you want to say, hey, some of it's useful, the implication is therefore the field is useful, or therefore all of it is useful, and that wouldn't follow. And it could just be that there's good philosophy, there's bad philosophy, and the problem is that no one is distinguishing between the two and pointing to any clear standards for saying, hey, we have a problem, which is that there's lots of bad philosophy. We need to criticize that without this impugning all the good philosophy.
Philosophers of physics and physicists about the foundations of quantum mechanics and relativity. For instance, there's tons of collaboration between physicists and philosophers of physics like David Albert, Barry Lower, and lots of others. Philosophers play integral roles in lots of interdisciplinary scientific research. The Free Will Show, in fact, had a whole season of their excellent podcast dedicated to free will in science. And they brought on lots of scientists and philosophers talking about their joint work on scientific research on free will, and how philosophers have played a key role in this scientific research. Philosophers play integral roles in lots of psychological research too, such as working closely with famous psychologists, Paul Bloom, David Pizarro, and so many more. Also, philosophy is pretty important for science, in particular, not only for lots of the reasons previously mentioned, right? I mean, like it helps significantly in assessing any argument, whether inside or outside science. It helps in pinpointing any implicit assumptions in lines of reasoning, etc. It helps to very clearly and precisely articulate distinctions that are used within scientific debates, as well as that are used within, for instance, survey research. But also, philosophy is pretty important for science because values play a huge role in science. And philosophy...
Okay. Values play a huge role in science, so philosophy is important. I'm not quite sure what the argument there is.
Well, I think this is going to come from almost like as if people don't have motivations or values or something unless they've critically thought about them in the right way, where critically thinking about them in the right way means thinking about them in the way that you would be trained to do by studying a certain kind of moral philosophy or something. And yeah,
see, that's exactly what I'm talking about when I talk about, like, if someone working in like, I don't know, biomedical engineering or something, and they're like, hey, we need to consider the bioethical issues here. And then they start thinking about it, and maybe they wouldn't do it well if they didn't have a background or training or some studying in philosophy. But I think there's a failure to distinguish between whether thinking about values in a systematic way and thinking about them in the specific way that contemporary analytic philosophers have. Like, you need to think about it in terms of deontology, consequentialism, virtue ethics.
Yeah.
That's the way to do it. And you have to do it by using intuitions. You have to do it using like the method of cases. You have to do it using reflective equilibrium. And if you don't use the methods that we use, you're not doing it right. And so there's like, which one is it? Is it that we need to think about these issues systematically, or we need to think about them systematically using your methods and employing your presuppositions and saddled with the particular history that you believe is super critical? Like, basically, do we need to do, it's like if someone's saying you need religion. Let's just say we needed religion. Okay, does that mean I need to read your scripture? Do I need to follow your doctrines? Do I need to do your rituals and celebrate your holidays? Or can another one suffice? So it would be like if a Christian was confused between the distinction between like religion and Christianity and kept saying religion's important. And you're like, yeah, I agree religion's important. And they're like, great, so you agree that Christianity and like Christ needs to be our savior?
Yeah.
No. And I think it's a similar thing here.
It in this case, it's almost as if, you imagine someone saying, look, I really care about not destroying the planet through climate change or something. And then your response to them is to say, oh, so are you a deontologist or a consequentialist or something, right? And it's like, what the heck? Like, it's like, when was the last time you talked to a normal person, sort of thing? Because I just don't know how to. It's like you can't see past the way that you've been trained to think of this debate in those terms, as if the only way to legitimately have values is if you hold one of these particular normative frameworks or something. And there's so many problems with thinking that way, because it's almost like, I think when we're doing philosophy that, we have to take the world as it is and then try to provide true explanations of the world as it is. Whereas instead, what this view does is it's like, well, there's a secret true way to use, like values and moral laden terms and things. And then we sort of discover that by doing philosophy. And then we find out that the rest of the world was wrong in the way that they think about values and use them and stuff like that. I just think it's so backwards, because that's the very thing you're supposed to be explaining, is moral discourse and the fact that people value things in the first place. You're supposed to be trying to get clear about what's actually going on, rather than just coming up with something that's very different and then prescribing it back to people. But
yeah, it's just making me think, someone wants to work on climate change or something like that, and then someone goes, well, would this policy violate the categorical imperative? Or does this judgment stem from an impartial concern with the maximizing beneficence or something like that?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people trying to answer these questions would be like, I don't give a shit. Give me the data. And we want basically the same thing here, which is like less dead fish, more thriving coral reefs.
Yeah.
Can we please figure that out? Because there's a bunch of questions we need to figure out here. Like, how do we reduce
do you really want that? Do you really want that? Or do you just want it in an anti-realist sense?
What do you mean exactly by catastrophe? This shit's burning. But what do you mean by burning? I'm lampooning philosophy a little bit, but it's just that there's so much of this navel-gazy self-congratulations that I don't know what would happen if you had this like committee that had like hydrologists and like engineers and ecologists, and they were all working on like how to save some endangered species or something, and then you just added a bunch of philosophers to it. Maybe the philosophers, like maybe a bunch of philosophers of biology would have some really cool things to say. I don't know. But I feel like if you added a lot of philosophers, that they would have very little to contribute. And a lot of the things that they might say would just be useless platitudes. And then people would feel like, I think a lot of philosophers are able to speak and articulate what they're contributing in ways that are really platitudinous and sound like, deepities, and make people feel like the philosophers are adding something. But a lot of it to me looks like poetic incantations that make people feel better about what's being done without really adding much to it.
Yeah. I think as though there could be a point here that's close to a point that we made earlier, which is that what's practical depends upon what you value, right? And so what's being said about values here could potentially be close to something that we'd both agree with, which I think would be something like the types of practical questions that you're trying to solve are essentially driven by like certain things that you value doing, and so then there are values in science or something like that. But then the question is, how are we to say that? How is philosophy supposed to be connected to getting at the real values, right? Or instead those values determined by what people want more broadly culturally, or things like that, rather than people kind of like doing philosophy and then really discovering what the values are or something.
Yeah. Let's wrap this up. I think we got 4 minutes left.
Sure.
Specifically ethics, is needed to examine these evaluative questions. Right, for more on values in science, I recommend checking out Kane B's excellent video on values in science. There are evaluative questions relating to scientific funding, to the applications of scientific findings, to scientific experimentation, for instance, the extent of permissible experimentation on humans, non-human animals, etc., and so much more. Like, there are various evaluative questions pertaining to what should we fund. There's a reason there are philosophers on ethics review boards for scientific experiments. To properly engage all these evaluative questions in science, we need good ethical reasoning. In other words, we need good philosophy, as ethics is a subfield of philosophy. Another thing Priest doesn't mention is that philosophy is needed, if only because there's lots of bad reasoning and mistaken philosophy out there, which needs good philosophy to serve as a corrective. If you think, for instance, that advancing transgender...
Yeah, imagine if a fire department, like 80% of them accidentally went around stumbling into things and causing fires. And then you said we really need fire departments to put out all the fires caused by fire departments.
Yeah.
That almost... I don't know.
Yeah.
We need philosophy to correct all the problems philosophy is causing. I mean, maybe, but I think I would rather say that we need good philosophy to counter bad philosophy, or we need useful philosophy to counter the homeopathic philosophy. And of course, I agree with that. And again, that goes back to like, if there's people that say it's all bad, I don't agree. There's good stuff. And I agree we need the good stuff to counter the bad stuff. But we need to be careful not to conflate that with saying, if there's good philosophy and we need it to counter the bad philosophy, then philosophy is useful. And then use that as a blanket pass for all the stuff that's really questionable that goes on. Your thoughts on
that? So I think the first thing I need to do is buy another used car, because the used car I just bought broke down. I really fucked up that joke. What I mean is, like building on that point that you said about if a fire department was going around causing lots of fires, right? It's kind of like, it's like you need to first address the issues with the thing before you just kind of go around willy-nilly expanding what it does, right? So yeah, it's very late for me as well. That's why I'm not making much sense.
Yeah, that's why I can tell that you're fading out here, and I'm getting tired too. I'm trying not to shout, but I feel like I've been slowly, like I see me in the video, I think I've been moving downward. I gotta sit up. Energy, let's do this.
We'll get through.
All right.
Rights, expanding access to gender-affirming healthcare, etc., is a good thing, then you'll need good philosophy to address those who raise philosophical objections to your pro-transgender stances, such as objections based on the alleged nature of gender, sex, identity, social construction, and whatnot. Similarly, if you think advancing transgender rights, expanding access to gender-affirming healthcare, etc., is a bad thing, then you'll need good philosophy to address those who raise philosophical objections to your anti-transgender stances, such as objections based, again, on the alleged nature of gender, sex, identity, social construction, and whatnot. So, in summary, even if we suppose that philosophy is useless, people are generally going to be using philosophy to draw conclusions on the basis of that, and so they're kind of subverting their own argument. That's what they're going to be tending to do. But in any case, it's simply false that philosophy is useless. There are tons of personal intellectual benefits that it cultivates in terms of reasoning and critical thinking skills, analytical reading and writing, and in general, just gaining lots of transferable skills, scoring well on the LSAT and GRE, and so on. There are benefits in terms of informing our moral and political views, which help us live better lives. Philosophy has been integral in giving birth to lots of other disciplines like computer science, psychology, economics, science itself. Philosophy and philosophers play key roles in lots of interdisciplinary work with regard to AI, the foundations of quantum mechanics and relativity, empirical research on free will, empirical research on cognition, moral judgment, moral psychology. Yet another reason philosophy is important for science is because values play a huge role in science with respect to what should get funding, with respect to how we should apply certain scientific findings, with respect to permissible scientific experimentation, and so on. These are all ethical questions which fall under the banner of philosophy. And finally, philosophy is needed, if only because there's tons of bad reasoning and mistaken philosophy out there. Oh, and also, it's just pretty fun. And fun things are fun, aren't they? I mean, what, you're gonna say like soccer is useless? And like, okay, I mean, like, even supposing that it is, it's fun. I'm gonna do it. I don't care if it doesn't really serve a practical use. And perhaps being fun is itself a kind of utility. Likewise, at least for me, I find philosophy fun. And if you're watching this, you probably do too. And if not, I hope the wonders of the majesty of reason can help you at least find some fun in it. And finally, on this point about philosophy's utility, I highly recommend Friction Philosophy's video, What is the Value of Philosophy? It's basically like an interview supercut with tons of different philosophers, just kind of off the cuff, giving what they think is the value of philosophy. They raise tons of considerations that I don't even raise in here. I also recommend Bertrand Russell's lecture on the value of philosophy and Graham Priest's full lecture on the nature of philosophy and its role in the university, clips of which I played earlier. All of these can be found in my Doing Philosophy playlist. All right, and that's all she wrote for part 1 of this 7-part series.
Okay, we could wrap it up there. The rest is like administrative stuff, I guess. So
At least we got to the real reason in the end.
yeah, well, I'm tempted. I don't know if this is true for Joe, but I think a lot of I think a lot of philosophers mostly do philosophy because they want to, because they like it, because it's fun. And I think philosophy is recreational activity, and everything else is rationalization for what's a recreational activity for them.
Yeah, I don't know if I could say everything like 100%, but I think that's a large part of it. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, and wait, what is that image? I just brought this back, and now the image is bigger. It looks like something like AI Wittgenstein or something.
Yeah, it is. I don't know if you remember when those AI image generation tools were like really popular a couple of years ago or something, but I think it was like do an icon of Wittgenstein or something, and this was what it came out with. So.
Well, I have a recent one from that's a Wittgenstein that I'll show you, and I guess we'll wrap up with that because I thought it turned out really well. Like the image for this video is AI generated. The I'll tell you the prompt for this. Did you see the thumbnail for this?
No, I didn't.
Check the thumbnail. It's like a philosopher in the desert. Okay. And the prompt was a cartoon depiction of a philosopher in Greek robes alone in the desert, crawling across the ground because they have no water and they are exhausted. I don't know that that's the best way to do a prompt, but let me show you the Wittgenstein one.
Yeah, sure. Let's see.
But yeah, I do think a lot of philosophers do philosophy because they find it enjoyable. I actually don't think that's a terrible reason to do philosophy. But I do think that if you said, hey, look, why does this institution exist? And you said, oh, because we have fun doing it. I think a lot of people would be pretty concerned given the way that philosophy presents itself. Like if it really came down to them just doing it for fun.
Yeah. And I think there's another competing thing, which is like, because it makes me seem smart to other people. And I do think that is a bad reason to do philosophy, because it's like, why do you want to just appear smart to other people and not do something more useful with your time?
Yeah, I don't know that a lot of them would be conscious of that if that were a genuine motivation. And if they were, I'm not sure how many would want to publicly confess to such a thing.
Yeah, I think that's something for individuals to reflect on and maybe think if they're doing. But I think if you ever catch yourself in, arguments and debates where you try to use more intimidating vocabulary to beat someone, or you determined afterwards to go away and really reinforce your views by gathering more information, something like that, then maybe you can question whether you're really in it to try and figure out what's true, or whether you're in it to try and have stuff to say, right, in arguments that defeats people and feel good about yourself as a kind of superhero type, intellectual superhero or something.
Yeah. I don't know. Do you know how to upload an image? Like, can
I'm not sure.
Can I just show an image?
I think your best bet is to just open it and then screen share it. If you can open it in like a browser window or something.
I don't know how to.
Have you got it as a file?
Yeah.
You might be able to get the path to the file and just paste that into your browser. Or if you sometimes if you right click open with and then select your browser or something like that on the image.
Ah, bummer. I don't know how to. I don't know what I could do with it. It's not obvious.
If you've got it, can you just open it like on your computer in a window? If you double click on the
Yeah,
image,
it's open.
and then if you click the present thing on StreamYard, you should be able to select it. So if you click
Oh yeah,
present,
no, that works.
share screen. Yeah.
Boom. So there's one of them.
Oh, he's looking a little bit unhinged in that one.
Here's another. But this is the one that I
see the same one. I think you're just sharing
sorry.
one window. Yeah.
Okay. I'll close it and then I'll show you the other ones. I haven't done it before, so right.
Yeah, don't worry.
Okay, this is the one that I liked, and I'll share it in a second. Present. There we go.
I don't know why in all of your pictures he's looking so angry.
I don't know. That's how he came out.
You didn't ask it for angry Vicar design.
No. I don't remember what I did ask it for. Let me go look. I'll go check the prompt and see what I said. But I'm done talking about philosophy. I don't think my brain is going to work anymore.
Yeah, that's all right. That's what happens. That's what happens when you leave philosophy behind. You just become stupid.
Yeah, maybe the philosophical powers are attacking me.
Yeah.
No, this is just like abstract, geometric, colorful, black and white. Like it's not. Those are the prompts. There's nothing about him being angry. That's it.
Interesting.
It's philosophy, Wittgenstein, abstract, strange, geometric, colorful, black and white. I put strange in there. I don't know why.
Yeah.
I was probably copying a prompt that looked cool.
Yeah. Well, they do look pretty cool.
That's going to do it for me.
Yeah, no problem.
Pictures. Yeah, Midjourney is really cool. I'm using it more for images now. Like I'm actually paying to get images made, and it does some pretty cool. Have you messed around with that, or what do you use?
I mean, I usually just use Canva and put some stuff together, but I do think that using AI tools would probably be a bit easier now. I've just not played around with doing it for thumbnails, to be honest.
Yeah, I use both. I still use Canva for a lot of stuff. Okay, this is totally relevant to philosophy. I'm going to have to close it up there. I know people have questions in the chat from like an hour ago. Just put them in the comments and I'll get to it later.
1 a.m. for me now. 1 a.m.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining me. I'm going to play the outro video, so I guess you can head on out.
Yeah.
So thanks so much for being here. And get some sleep. I'll talk to you later.
Yeah, see you in a bit. Thanks, man. Bye.
Bye. All right, everybody. This went for 3 hours, so we're going to wrap it up there. I just hit the 3:04 mark. Thanks everybody for being here. That was a lot. I hope some of that proved useful or was entertaining. And if not, too bad. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, leave comments in the comment section. I love to engage with people. If you got questions, I'll try to get to them. It's 3 hours. I can't do more questions. So if you had more, then I'll do my best to get to them. I read all the comments in the comment section. I always go through and read them. I even sometimes come back and check and see if there's a video I was in and I don't get a notification, I'll check. Did someone, write something? So I like to engage in the comment section. So please do that. So all of this stuff, like, subscribe. That was Nathan from Digital Gnosis. You could check out that channel. You could like, subscribe, check out that content too. And I will catch you all later, and take care. See you next week.